Ladies and gentlemen, today is October the 1st, and we are about to begin another episode of World Discussion. This is meant to be a live and breathing conversation, so if you have any input or feedback for us, or questions, or comments, or corrections, we are open to that. We're going to talk about current events, foreign policy, economics, world history, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to jump into Discord with Mr. Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Pretty solid. How are you doing?
Can't complain.
Yep. Is it cooling off there finally? We're still over 100.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely not as bad as it was.
Good.
So that's nice.
And I saw your messages last week that you got some Baldur's Gate action going.
Yeah, I've been thoroughly distracted since I got it, so...
Yeah.
Not a very productive few weeks for me.
Yeah. Well, I will take the blame for that. I sponsored it. I was talking up the game and then paid Agent Smith extra so that he could get a Baldur's Gate. And you said you updated your GPU?
Oh, yeah, I had to. There was no way I could run it otherwise.
Nice. How far into it did you get?
Well, I'm taking my time. It's slow going.
Hmm.
I think I'm somewhere in Act 2 right now.
Hmm. That's pretty far along, though.
Yeah, we're getting there.
And you said you're a human monk?
Yeah, I went with a monk.
Nice.
I like the dialogue options.
Yeah, monk is really cool. I have a monk character that's level 5, not quite to Act 2 yet, but close to it. The punching sounds are really satisfying. When you just kick someone in the face and kill them with it, it's like, that was pretty badass. Which, did you choose a spec for your monk yet? Like the subclass?
Yeah, it was, what is it, Elemental? The nature one?
Yeah. That one gives you water spells, fire spells,
Yeah.
thunder spells,
That's the
yeah.
one.
That's the same that I went. It's like Avatar.
Well, I kind of liked that I could re-up the key
Yeah.
with one of the abilities. That kind of attracted me.
Mm-hmm.
Although I wasn't aware at the time that it was only, what was it, like once every long rest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes there's stuff I overlook or things the game doesn't always explain too well, and I end up having to learn the hard way.
Yeah, one of the ones that I learned from Reddit that I didn't know, and I have been doing it wrong for about 120 hours of gameplay, is the spell True Strike. It makes that target marked so that anyone who attacks it has advantage. I thought that it buffs your ally with advantage on their next attack roll, but I was actually making my own characters more vulnerable because the tooltip doesn't specify one way or the other, but everyone on Reddit was saying it's like the worst spell ever because you might as well just shoot them with a bow or do some simple attack instead of doing that. Yeah, and no one in my chat, and this is on you guys too, no one in my chat corrected me this whole time, so y'all been doing it wrong too. I think it's their fault they didn't clarify the language for that, but yeah, True Strike is to debuff an enemy target. It is not to buff your ally, so don't sabotage yourself, chat. Stay safe.
Yeah. Yeah, spell management is interesting because of the spell slot system.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to be very, very conservative because I'm always afraid I'm not going to have them when I need them.
Yeah. Yeah, it always feels bad if you get into a fight and it ends up being way harder than you expected and you're totally out of gas.
Yeah.
You have nothing to do about it.
Yeah, so that makes me a little paranoid. So I tend to hoard them a little, which is not always great. I should probably just be more liberal with them.
Yeah.
Since I've got more than enough camp supplies at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm always paranoid that I'm going to like reach some spot in the game where I can't do that, where I can't rest.
Mm-hmm. What companions are you playing with?
Yeah, I saw you, actually. I saw you playing like the very early part of the game, and I realized that I'd missed one. Yeah, I think it's Gavin, because you have to touch the portal.
Oh, Gale, yeah.
Gale, yeah, that guy. And I didn't do that. You know, the narrator said that it looked unstable, and I just said, well, fuck that then. Why would I touch that?
Yeah.
So I missed him. And then the other one, Asterius, is that his name?
Asterion, yeah.
Yeah. So he tried to kill me the first time I met him, so I told him to fuck off.
I did the same thing. So, Chad, if you don't want spoilers, mute the stream for 2 minutes. I allowed him into my camp in my first playthrough, and then in the night, he tried to drink the blood of my main character, and I was like, I do not want to be a vampire. I don't know you like that, and I did not consent to you drinking my blood. You are out of the camp. And everyone's like, where's Asterion? It's like, I yeeted him from the camp. He broke the rules, and I don't tolerate that. And then, who is it? Lizael, the Gith character. I kicked her from the party as well because she was just rude to people. I've heard that she gets nicer as you go, so a lot of the characters, like, I'm just kind of going with my gut of what I would do in the situation rather than just give everyone infinite chances and see if their story changes.
Yeah, the role play is kind of the funnest part, really.
Yeah.
So I give it a lot of credit for that. Also, I kind of wanted to just test out the story because, you know, a well-designed RPG should be flexible enough that it should still be an interesting story, even if you don't have all of the characters. So I kind of wanted to put the game through its paces a little bit. See how much I could get away with there. It seems to be working out so far. It's definitely engaging.
Yeah. My campaign playthroughs are quite different based on who lived and who died, because I play on Tactician, which is pretty hard difficulty. Like, that's the max one. And sometimes there's a character that has a bunch of story that you could even have in your party, and they just die, and you can't resurrect them before they're a party member of yours. Like, they're just permanently dead. And I'm playing a duos campaign with my friend streamer Apoptosis, and in that campaign we're trying to keep a play it as it lies approach rather than reloading saves to try to save characters. And boy howdy, almost all of them are dead. We only have 2 people in camp aside from our characters, so it's been a very chaotic run. And there was this little using what?
I was going to say you're probably using the hirelings, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think I have Karlak with me, and then he has a hireling. But there's this like rare cache item that you are tasked with getting early on, and it doesn't say what's in it, but it does say that there's a creature inside of it. And there was this big fight. You probably already did the fight because you're in Act 2, but by the Druids Grove where all the Tieflings are, sometimes the Druids and the Tieflings will end up fighting each other. And they were doing so, and he didn't know it was in this. He threw it, and it was a Spectator, which is like a huge eye, level 12 massive creature that just casts beams and everything, and it just started killing everyone. So, like, neither the Tieflings nor the Druids lived, only the Spectator and us lived, so it's a complete ghost town. So, our Act 1 basically was just an apocalypse, and no one lived to tell the tale.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoy how much flexibility there is. There's lots of different stories that you can tell through the game. Very enjoyable. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yep. You can also do evil playthroughs too and just like side with the bad characters. I tried to do that on my monk character, and I got like through one of the fights, and I just felt so bad that I reloaded it, and I'm just playing a good character again because it's like, I don't want to kill that guy.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Yeah, I prefer to do my usual social justice murderer roleplay. Just kill all the evil things.
Yep.
It suits me.
Yep.
I find.
I kill lots of people, but only people who deserve it.
Yeah, there's actually a class that's like that. I think it's like Paladin.
Paladin is interesting because you have an oath, and if you betray your oath, you lose your powers.
Yeah, and they have like, what is it, 3 different oaths you can choose from?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty neat mechanic. I'm kind of interested in trying it at some point. Yeah, I would probably do Explorer. And my first playthrough, I'm just doing like the medium difficulty, but after that, since I'm mostly interested in the story, I would probably just do Explorer so that it's a little faster.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm nowhere near finished with the game, but I'm already like almost 200 hours in. So I'm just achingly slow. Some of that is just leaving the computer on while I do other stuff, though. But even still, It just takes a lot of time, and I've got other things that I should be doing.
Yeah.
But thank you. It's a very nice gift. Much appreciated.
Hell yeah, great game. Easy game of the year. People have said Starfield is also good. I haven't tried it yet, but that's like another RPG-ish game, but it's set in space. I haven't finished Baldur's Gate either because I have like 3 characters, and I'm not really in a rush to learn the end story yet. So it's all good.
Well, other than role-playing games, what's shaking?
So I'm getting cheesed right now, but there was probably a decent bit of stuff that's happened since we've last done a world discussion. I heard Slovakia got a new leader of some kind that's apparently pro-Russia in their policy and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think... Is the election over? I was reading about... oh, no, you're right. Yeah, that's new. 13 hours ago.
Mm.
Yeah, there was a sort of party sympathetic to Russia, shall we say, that was running. And that their president actually had been president previously, but he'd been voted out on the back of a big scandal after a activist was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, he and his party were never, like, found culpable in that murder, but people were suspicious. But now they're back, looks like. I think it was supposed to be a pretty close election. Yeah, I'm looking at the article now. Oh, yeah, they won pretty big. Clear lead. Yeah, he was saying he was going to cut support to Ukraine, but then the criticism I read is that they weren't really sending much. They basically already sent all of the surplus equipment and whatnot that they had on offer. So they'd kind of already done everything they could realistically do. And given that it's a relatively small country, there wasn't really prospect for more.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, given how expensive things are in Europe right now with inflation and, you know, the energy shock back in 22, the idea of, you know, cutting foreign aid was popular to a lot of people.
Mm.
Yeah, the broader concern is that he's kind of like mind with guys like Viktor Orban, you know, in the sense that he's sort of a liberal Democrat, you know, somebody who kind of nominally plays by the rules of liberal democracy, but then tries to skew the rules to benefit him and his party.
Mm-hmm.
So some people are a little concerned Slovakia could end up like Hungary, you know, if he's able to stay in power. But that's anybody's guess. It's still early days. And Slovakia is smaller than Hungary. So, you know, even if they do go that way, there's a limit to how much damage they could realistically do. Yeah, we'll see what happens.
What's the population of Slovakia?
Oh, it's very, what is it, like 6 million? I'm going to look it up.
Oh.
I was close, 5.4 million.
Huh.
Yeah, it's mostly a mountainous country. It's almost like, have you ever heard of the Carpathian Mountains?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the Carpathian Mountains actually run through Slovakia and pretty much dominate most of the country. So, you know, if you want to have, if you want a rough analogy, you could kind of consider it a part of Europe's equivalent of the Appalachians.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sort of a more mountainous, rugged terrain, you know, more of a mineral type economy, a little bit poorer
Hillbillies.
than their neighbors. Oh, yeah,
Hillbillies.
kind of like that. Yeah, I don't know that they would appreciate that particular analogy, but yeah, just a little bit poorer and somewhat unfavorable terrain.
Mm.
Yeah, fun fact, the capital is actually very close to Vienna. It's actually on the, whatchamacallit, the Danube River, which is the major river that runs through southeastern Europe. And Slovakia's capital, Bratislava, if I'm not mistaken, used to be a major city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire when it was actually majority German, if I remember correctly. And because of all the tumult in the early 20th century with the world wars and all of the ethnic cleansing and all of that kind of stuff, the German population ended up being expelled. And afterwards it became majority Slovakian. and became the capital of Slovakia correspondingly. Yeah, Bratislava is like way in the southwest corner of the country. Yeah, normally you think of capitals as being geographically centered in a given country, but every so often you'll find one where that's not true, and Slovakia is one of those. It's kind of located in the west and the flat part of the country. There's more fertile land.
Cool. I don't know that much about that country.
Yeah, few do. I suspect even in Europe, it's probably not well known.
And it was part of Czechoslovakia before, I'm guessing, back when that was a thing?
Yeah, correct. It was the eastern half of Czechoslovakia.
Why did they split again?
Yeah, the Velvet Divorce. Whoa. So, yeah, that's what they called it.
Fancy name, yeah.
Well, they called it that because it was peaceful and nonviolent, unlike a lot of the sort of ethnic conflicts in the region at that time. I'm sure everybody remembers what happened in Yugoslavia in that same period of time. Not so velvet there, as it were. But yeah, at the end of the Cold War, when communist governments in Eastern Europe were starting to loosen up control, ethnic identities sort of were resurgent, and there was a kind of tide of ethno-nationalism. And, that ethno-nationalism came in various shades and styles. Obviously, in the Balkans, it tended to be more vindictive and violent. But in other countries, it tended to be a little more chill. So in Czechoslovakia, fortunately, the resurgence in ethnic identity was not so violent. But it did result in a desire for an independent ethnic state for the different ethnic groups in Czechoslovakia. So that resulted in a referendum, and the pro-independence crowd won, and that was the end of it. And just sort of peaceably separated.
When diplomacy doesn't fail. Interesting.
Yeah, everything kind of worked out pretty well. In general, the Czech Republic, or Czechia, as I guess it's called now, and Slovakia have done better than other countries in the former Eastern Bloc in terms of economic performance and stability, especially Czechia. Czechia is definitely a standout. Prague is considered like a very desirable place to live, relative to the cost of living. And given sort of economic conditions and amenities, like that's a very attractive city for a lot of people. And in general, just the country's politics and culture are pretty good overall, all things considered. Slovakia can be a little more unpredictable, again, with the populism in the region and in Slovakia's politics. It can be a little more eventful than people would like. And the economy hasn't been as successful as some of the surrounding countries. But beyond that, they've done okay. There hasn't been any major wars, major instability, etc. So they're doing better than Hungary, but maybe not as well as Czechia. Sort of a comfortable in between, you might say.
What is Czechia's economy based on?
It's intertwined with the German economy. One of the things that happened after the end of the Cold War was that Eastern Europe was, for the first time in many decades, economically reintegrated into the economy of Western Europe. And some of that was just agriculture, sort of restoring the flow of foodstuffs and minerals and other sorts of primary economic type materials, but also manufacturing. So the interesting thing that happened with manufacturing, besides the fact that a lot of state-run manufacturers in the former communist states ended up collapsing because they were not very competitive. But the other thing that happened is that Western manufacturers, specifically German ones, started outsourcing some of their manufacturing, some of their factories and whatnot, the manufacture of some of their goods to these Eastern European states. And Poland and Czechia in particular were major recipients of those outsourcing efforts. And they've sort of benefited significantly, economically speaking, from that. So obviously, outsourcing is pretty controversial in the West and has, been the source of some consternation on the part of labor and on the part of the communities that were previously dependent on that manufacturing activity. But for Eastern European states that benefited from it, it was a significant help to restructuring their economies and getting on a trajectory of economic growth and improved standards of living. And a lot of that was automotive in nature. So sort of more marginal parts of the logistical chain involved in the production of automobiles rather. Those were sort of relocated. The ones that were basically more labor intensive and could benefit from the cheaper labor and lower costs of production in places like Poland and Czechia. Wages have risen since then, so there's not as much of a competitive advantage, but the economic activity and growth that it generated has helped pay for other new industries and firms and whatnot in those countries that have helped kind of make up the difference. So overall, it's been pretty much a success story in so much as it's helped them, kind of reach not quite parity with the West, but sort of on that path.
Nice. Today I learned. Someone in chat says Czechoslovakia is literally a non-existent entity made up by the Soviets.
Oh. That's not entirely true, actually, because it actually existed before the Soviets moved into Eastern Europe, right? It was actually created after World War One, and actually it was its creation was in no small part due to the machinations of the United States. Woodrow Wilson, of course, famously sort of conditioned American support in the war on what would you call it? Autonomy, right? No, not autonomy. Self-determination. That was one of the major goals for Wilson's foreign policy as far as American involvement in World War One. So a lot of these ethnic minorities in Europe that had previously not had self-determination, because of Wilson's influence, were able to receive some degree of it. That process ended up being way messier than Wilson himself had ever intended, as subsequent events illustrated. But because Wilson went out of his way, in particular, to try to negotiate an independent state for the Czechoslovak people, which ended up being the state of Czechoslovakia, people in the United States had a sort of weird affinity and attachment to Czechoslovakia that the country did not have towards other countries that emerged in the wake of World War One. And that's one of the reasons why when Czechoslovakia at the end of World War II ended up, however you want to frame it, subjugated by the communists, let's say, when that happened, a lot of people in the United States were very upset about that. It's worth mentioning, too, that Czechoslovakia after World War I was pretty much the only country in the region to set up something resembling a successful liberal democracy, in addition to having a somewhat stable economy. So, the United States helped create Czechoslovakia and ended up being pretty successful. And so, that also helped build affinity for the country. So when Czechoslovakia fell to the communists, people in the United States were very upset and, wanted to know why Washington had not done more to try to prevent it. And the reason that's worth mentioning, too, in the context of the overarching Cold War that was happening at that time, is that the American public was not nearly so sympathetic to other states in Eastern Europe that ended up coming under the thrall of Moscow. So Poland in particular was an example. Poland, like Czechoslovakia, was not communist before World War II, but ended up with communist government after, owing to, Soviet influence. But people in the United States had not really had the highest opinion of Poland before World War II. Unlike Czechoslovakia, Poland in the interwar years had an authoritarian government led by a dictator. I think his name was Pilsudski. Is that what? Maybe somebody in chat would know better than I would. But regardless, people were not really as sympathetic to Poland because it did not have a democratic government. And so there was not nearly as much angsting over the communists seizing power in Poland as there was in Czechoslovakia. Even though Poland was the bigger country and it actually happened earlier. Yeah, I think the communists seized power in Poland before Czechoslovakia, but that was not really considered as egregious in the minds of people in the United States as when Czechoslovakia later on suffered a similar coup. Yeah, that's when it really got people's attention. Washington was not surprised by any of it. Diplomats in Washington were well aware that the Soviet Union had effectively been granted by the United States a de facto sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And so there was a kind of mutual understanding between both Moscow and Washington that, Western Europe was American influence, Eastern Europe was under Soviet influence. And that was sort of the basis for negotiations and relations in Europe between the Soviet Union and the United States. So nobody was shocked when the Soviets imposed, communist governments in the countries in their own sphere of influence. That was pretty much expected, but that had not really been communicated to the broader public. Even today, it's kind of controversial to a degree amongst those who care. Obviously, most people, don't really give a shit about post-war history. It's kind of a niche topic, but amongst those who do, there's some angst that that agreement was made. So it's no surprise that Washington was kind of cagey about the details of that agreement that was made with the Soviets, and that the broader American public was not really privy to those negotiations.
So you're saying it wasn't like a formal treaty agreement? It was more kind of like we just talked to them and said, you keep to your side of the map and we'll keep to our side of the map?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was an agreement that was hashed out at the Yalta Conference in 1945, I want to say. Maybe actually 44, wasn't it?
Oh, so right at the end of World War II, kind of.
Yeah, there was a series of conferences over the course of World War II between Allied leaders, the Cairo Conference, Yalta, I think Berlin? No, Potsdam. I think it was Potsdam. Oh, Yalta was 45. Okay. Yeah, I just looked it up. But yeah, Yalta in particular was the one where they kind of negotiated what the post-war environment would look like. The details were hashed out later, and obviously there wasn't entirely consensus on a lot of the subject matter, as evidenced by the emergence of the Cold War and competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But among the things that was agreed is that the U.S. and the Soviet Union would have de facto spheres of influence in Europe after the war. That's actually how that's how Greece ended up not becoming communist. If you look at a map of Eastern Europe, and if you look at where the Red Army was moving in 1944 and 1945, you might expect that the Red Army would have moved into Greece and liberated it along with countries, pushed the Germans out, let's say, from countries like Bulgaria, Romania, etc. In general, the Red Army just blew through the Balkans in 1944. But why not Greece? Why didn't Greece end up also being the recipients of the Red Army and subsequent Soviet influence? And the reason is that at the Yalta Conference, Greece was effectively recognized by Moscow as a part of the British sphere of influence, which was not as discussed at that time. Obviously, the United States was sort of the senior partner at that point. But the Soviets, and to a lesser degree the Americans, did recognize that the British had their own sphere of influence and that Greece fell within it. That was a long-standing thing. That wasn't new. The British had played a big role in liberating Greece from the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century, and they had had sort of a weird special relationship with them ever since. So everybody kind of saw Greece as being a partner, a close partner of the United Kingdom, even if they weren't necessarily outright allies. And the result of that is that at the Yalta Conference, the Soviets agreed to stay out, and the British were able to muster what few forces they had in the Eastern Mediterranean at that point and actually attack and invade Greece themselves. And by that point, the Germans were already in retreat. They didn't want the Germans knew that if they didn't retreat from Greece, then the Soviets would just cut them off, because again, they were moving through Yugoslavia by 44, and getting cut off from the motherland and their supplies wasn't going to leave them in any kind of tenable position. So most of the Germans ended up just retreating, and the British were able to work with resistance fighters to just kind of breeze in and take over in their wake. And as a result, Greece never had a communist government.
So it sounds like the Western countries in the Soviet Union were like kind of chill and friends for a bit, or did we still not like them when these negotiations were being made? I guess I'm wondering, when did the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union sprout up, if during World War II, at least at the end, they were allies?
That's a tricky question. In general, like big picture, the United States and the Soviet Union were pretty strong allies over the course of the war, all the way up to the surrender of Japan in August 45. But the caveat is that a lot of that was basically the individual leaders, Joseph Stalin and FDR, President Roosevelt. They had something of a rapport. I think, Franklin Roosevelt gets criticized for being overly chummy with Stalin. And so some people think he was kind of naive in dealing with what was in effect a totalitarian, murderous dictator of a Hitlerian level.
Yeah.
So in that sense, maybe Roosevelt gave up more than he needed to. But then, of course, the counter argument is that the Red Army was blowing through Eastern Europe, and there wasn't realistically anything that the West could do about it. So having cordial relations was necessary in that sense, and realistic, in order to ensure that something could be hashed out that could represent some new status quo after the war. Regardless of how you read it, relations were decent. But that said, when you look at how much they trusted each other and look at what different actors within each government were thinking and saying about each other, there was less trust. The Soviets over the course of the war believed that the British and the Americans were kind of a single mind and represented a singular bloc, and that they were delaying an invasion of continental Europe, which was in the cards. Obviously, we were planning D-Day. But the Soviets wanted that to happen in like 1942, 1943. And they believed that the fact that it was delayed to 1944 was a deliberate choice on the part of the United States and Britain in order to ensure that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union bled each other white and were as weak as possible. So there was some unhappiness in Moscow on that count, with what they saw as duplicity on the part of London and Washington. And then on the part of Washington, there was, always kind of in the back of everybody's mind, knowledge and recognition of the fact that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian dictatorship and that it had expansionist tendencies and that it had cooperated with Nazi Germany in the early stages of the war. So everybody knew that they needed to work together against the common foe during the conflict, but there was very little sentiment in favor of the Soviet system, or very little optimism that relations would be overly cordial once the war was over. So cooperation was good during the war, but after the war, it was pretty much inevitable that there would be lots of mistrust. That was pretty much baked into the relationship. I would point out, too, an anecdote here, which is relevant. The United States offered to send Air Force. We didn't have an Air Force at the time. We had what was called the United States Army Air Force. The Air Force was actually part of the Army at the time. China would understand, but we do things differently now. But we offered to send air assets to the Soviet Union in order to attack targets in Eastern Europe and Germany, etc. And the Soviets did not want to do that. It kind of made sense. The Soviet Air Force did not have long-range strategic assets that could bomb targets, deep behind enemy lines like the U.S. Army Air Force or the Royal Air Force could do. But the Soviets were super paranoid about having Westerners running around in the Soviet Union, even if it was in a military capacity. And so the result of that was that they gave a very grudging affirmation that they would allow a very limited amount, but some Western air units would be allowed to operate from the Soviet Union. And I believe they ended up targeting oil infrastructure in Romania, specifically the Ploesti oil fields, and various other strategic targets of opportunity. But it was not as much as I imagine Washington or London wanted. So even during wartime, there was a degree of mistrust, especially on the part of the Soviet government, about the intentions and potential what you might consider political contamination that might result from deployments of Western personnel in the Soviet Union.
So I guess it seems to me like the alliance during World War II was completely an alliance of convenience. It wasn't really an alliance of ideological alignment.
Correct.
Which means that, yeah, we'll work with you, but we don't really like working with you because we don't like how you run your ship, but you run your ship at least less bad than our main opponent during World War II, so we're going to just fight the main opponent and then after be very careful about you because you're basically the next worst person. Kind of a thing.
Well, Nazi Germany was probably more powerful than the Soviet Union, and they were the ones who started the war, obviously.
Yeah.
So it made sense to kind of focus on them as the preeminent.
Yeah, you're allying with bad guy number 2 to defeat bad guy number 1.
Yeah, honestly, it was a big surprise. Not necessarily a big shock, but a big surprise that Nazi Germany ended up invading the Soviet Union. Because as you World War II buffs out there will remember, the Soviets and the Germans signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact, in which both the Soviet Union and Germany agreed that they would not attack each other. It was not an alliance per se, but They agreed that they would not mess with each other, and they also set up various, economic deals and whatnot. That was in 1940, I believe, and so that was a big deal. That really set off alarm bells. That made it very clear that there was a great deal of enmity amongst the authoritarian states of Europe towards the liberal democracies, and that Western Europe, what you might call liberal Europe, was very much on its own. Mm-hmm. And strategically speaking, that was a big win for Germany because it meant that they could avoid a two-front war, which was, obviously a big concern during World War I. So they were able to focus on France, gut France, conquer the Low Countries, conquer Norway, which was a weird one. People forget about the campaign in Norway. That was its own drama for a while. Mm-hmm. And it kind of looked like they just won the war, right? They had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. They'd conquered Western Europe. The only country really left was the UK. And it was not really clear to anybody at that time, how the UK could possibly turn things around. They were in quite a hole in 1940, suffice to say. And people were not optimistic, like at all, at least not outside the UK. It was actually a big shock to Hitler himself that Winston Churchill, at that stage, before the Battle of Britain, but after the fall of France, that Winston Churchill did not agree to peace talks. In fact, he did very much the opposite. He basically said, hey, fuck Hitler, we're going to keep fighting until we win. Regardless of how, whatever is necessary, we'll make it happen. But eventually, we'll win, one way or the other. And people kind of scoffed at that, especially outside the UK, because, how? How can you possibly just reconquer Europe from the Germans, who are just so powerful and have what seemed to be an unassailable position at that time? So obviously Churchill was thinking of getting America involved in the war. That was like his one final trump card. If he could just get the economic might of the United States on his side, then it would at least be possible. But beyond that, that couldn't happen if they quit. So, they just had to keep going as long as they could until they could try to convince Washington to jump in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when Germany finally just kind of quit the Battle of Britain, which is effectively what they did, and instead decided to just invade the Soviet Union, people were, I don't know, maybe delighted isn't the right word, but the fact that alleged alliance between the Soviet Union and Germany fell apart, and that Germany was turning its guns on this major rival to its east, that seemed to offer the strategic salvation that the British were really looking for. It wasn't the United States. They'd have to wait a bit longer for that. But it offered a ray of hope in a time when they were very much in a dark place. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the Germans turning on the Soviets was a surprise. You'd think they would want to finish the war they'd already started before starting a new one, but no. From the German government's perspective at that time, the British were not a threat. There wasn't anything they could do. They were isolated. They didn't think the Americans wanted to get involved at all. And, there was some evidence of that. So they figured, hey, fuck it. Let's go east. We'll conquer the Soviets. We'll get all of their resources, and then we'll be self-sufficient so we don't have to worry about things like sanctions or being cut off from key minerals and other materials that we need. Mm-hmm. So, it kind of made sense at the time. To the minds of German planners, they figured that the Soviets were a rotten, corrupt regime. The famous phrase is that all the Germans needed to do was kick the door in, and the whole house would collapse in on itself. That was the analogy that Hitler himself made as far as what would happen if the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Didn't work out, as is well known by now. But yeah, that was quite the shock when he made that shift. So yeah, the fact that the Soviets, and to bring this full circle, I kind of got off on a tangent. The Soviets and the Germans had an understanding, not an alliance, but an understanding. And it didn't necessarily shock, the West, like Washington and London, that, these authoritarian states were plotting against the liberal democracies. But it did kind of establish in the minds of the West that these people were, critical of the West, critical of liberalism, critical of democracy, and extremely skeptical of any potential for substantive mutual existence, basically. And, even after the Germans turned on the Soviets, there was a sense that while that made the Soviets de facto allies, it was not lost on anybody that the Soviets had been quite happy to work with the Germans. when they thought it was opportunistic to do so. And so that lasted, that sort of suspicion, that created a foundation of suspicion and mutual mistrust that lasted as an undercurrent through World War II and then became overt after World War II.
Makes sense.
And since you've got me talking about one of my favorite subjects, the Eastern Front in World War II, I think it's fair, to be fair to the Soviets, shall we say, I should point out that part of the reason for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not that the Soviets were just looking to ally with the Germans because they hated the West. They had actually been trying to build an alliance against Germany with the West in the mid-late 1930s. But the liberal democracies at that time were famously averse to confrontation with Germany. And the Soviets, for their part, were still very unpopular in Europe. Like, everybody still remembered when they tried to spread Red Revolution throughout the continent, the tail end of World War I and then through the early 1920s. The only thing that really stopped them was the Battle of Warsaw, in which the Poles were able to kind of defeat the Red Army and push them back into Russia proper, something which Poles are quite happy to brag about even today. So, the Russians, the Soviets more specifically, and Soviet communism, and Bolshevism too in particular, was very unpopular. It's worth remembering that it was not just communists that were ruling Russia in this period. It was Bolsheviks, and Bolsheviks were like the most extreme faction of communists in Europe at that time. So they weren't just like any old communists that had seized power. They were like the most violent, sort of cynical, realist communists of the whole bunch. And so that fact also alienated the Soviet Union from a lot of countries in the West. So that made it very difficult for them to engage diplomatically with the rest of Europe and build the kind of coalition that would have been necessary to really deter Nazi Germany. But then again, Western Europe was just inherently biased against any kind of cooperation. They didn't think anybody in their right mind after World War I would want to risk another European war. It just didn't make sense to people. Like, World War I was absolutely catastrophic. We today look back on World War II as absolutely catastrophic, which it was. But if you're just a guy living in the interwar years, 1920s and 30s, World War I is your frame of reference. And, looking at that, especially from the perspective of somebody who had maybe remembered the late Victorian era, right? Sort of that period from like 1890 to, 1914. For people who kind of grew up in that era, World War I was absolutely just devastating, just shocking. The late 19th century and the years before World War I were immensely prosperous. Everybody was doing well. For the most part, everybody was doing well. There was all this technological innovation. There were rapid advances. There was, kind of a growing sense that there was a balance of power. So, people were relatively secure, Balkans notwithstanding, as usual. So there was a sense that things were kind of looking up. And then World War I happened and just fucking obliterated that whole vision, that whole status quo ante that had rested in the minds of people in Europe was just shattered. And people became just horrifically aware of just how much destructive potential the new technological era that they had entered had. And it also destroyed just the underlying sense of optimism and faith in a lot of in European culture, if not European civilization generally. In the wake of World War I, people were a lot more cynical. There was a lot of despair. Economic conditions didn't help. Europe in general was not doing well after World War I. And that doesn't even get into all of the wars in Eastern Europe after World War I, which people in the West tend to kind of forget about, especially in the United States. We don't really teach much about that in history class. But World War I did not really end with the Treaty of Versailles. Certainly not with the armistice, in 1918. World War I begat a whole bevy of armed conflicts in Central and Eastern Europe that just raged on through a good chunk of the 1920s. The Russian Civil War is probably the biggest and most violent of them, but even in other countries in the region, there was a whole bunch of instability. There was an outright communist coup in Hungary, and then there was an authoritarian government led by an admiral. Just a lot of stuff like that people kind of overlook now in because the countries involved were sort of smaller. But it was just immensely destabilizing. And that kind of environment is not exactly conducive to any kind of positive outlook. And that was a contributing factor to the emergence of extremism in European politics in the era. Trying to circle around to how I got onto that.
I asked, I guess, how did the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union develop whenever there was an alliance during World War II?
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, long story short, yeah, there was a lot of mistrust just embedded, just because in that early period, in the interwar period, communists were seen as extremists, as violent, and that kind of came out of that violent period in World War I and after World War I, when the whole continent was just, rended was just sundered, let's say, by a violent conflict of all kinds. And extremist parties definitely benefited from that. The communists were among them. And the most violent communists of all, the Bolsheviks, were able to seize power in Russia. So that created a lot of mistrust right there. And of course, there were the purges, there was the expansionism, there was the, conquest of places like Tuva and Mongolia. There was lots of reasons to mistrust totalitarian movements of any kind, communists included, over the course of the 1920s and 30s. So that fed into that mistrust.
Makes sense.
No, that's what I was doing. I was talking about the Soviet attempts to sign an agreement with the West about Nazi Germany. That's what I was trying to get to.
Treaty of Versailles, yeah.
Yeah, well, not the Treaty of Versailles. Yeah, that ended World War I, but the fighting kept on after that. But I guess the point I was driving at was just to kind of color that period, to show how mistrustful the West was of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And that's why Soviet efforts to sign an agreement, creating an alliance against Nazi Germany in the mid-late 30s, never went anywhere. Or it's a big reason why. There was a time when London and Paris kind of vaguely entertained a notion. They actually did send some representatives to negotiate with the Soviet government, but the Soviets did not think they were taking it seriously, because they did not send high-level diplomats, or certainly not prime ministers of one kind or another. Instead, they sent mid-level officers from their respective militaries. And so the Soviets figured that was a de facto signal that the West was not actually interested in cooperation.
Sending some interns.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. So Moscow, after that, decided, okay, we're not going to be able to build an alliance against Nazi Germany, so we're going to have to do something different. And that's when they started shifting gears and trying to negotiate more directly with Nazi Germany. So it's not entirely their fault that they ended up signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There was some culpability by the West there as well. And keep in mind, too, over the course of all of these events that I'm talking about, the Soviets were also having to worry about the Empire of Japan, mm-hmm. which was very active in the 1930s. So it was probably a problem they could contain by itself, but if there was a war with Germany, it might be too much to handle even for the Red Army. Mm-hmm. I say that because over the course of the late 1930s, there were two major battles fought between the Red Army and the Imperial Japanese Army in northeastern China, in a territory that was called Manchuria, that had been broken off into a pro-Japanese puppet state. And there was some ambiguity about the borders between Manchuria and Russia, and the Imperial Japanese Army kind of tried to force some of those claims. Actually, no, it wasn't the border between Russia and Manchuria, it was the border between Mongolia and Manchuria. But for those of you who don't know, Mongolia was actually a communist puppet state that was de facto aligned with the Soviet Union in the 1930s. That's a whole other history. But regardless, the Japanese were not so reluctant to press territorial claims against communist Mongolia as they were against Russia. And the Russians, of course, backed their client state with the Red Army, and the result were two big battles in, I want to say, 1938 and then again in 1940. I think those were the battles of Namenhan and Khalkhin Gol. I think that's what I want to say they were. And the Red Army was able to win both of them. I think they actually suffered higher losses, but they were able to beat the Japanese pretty decisively. prototypical Russian approach, you might say. But the Japanese army kind of took the lesson that, it was not really worth fighting the Red Army. If they were going to fight them at all, it would have to be under very favorable circumstances. Also, fun trivia for you, the leader of the Russians in, I think, the Battle of Namenhan was actually no less than General Zhukov. And a lot of you East Front guys will no doubt remember he was the probably best and most important general in the Red Army over the course of World War II.
What made him so good?
So he was a very bold leader. He wasn't afraid of taking risks. And that sounds kind of mundane. Having officers take risks is not necessarily that unusual, but keep in mind, in the Red Army, under the totalitarian Soviet Union, as led by Joseph Stalin, risk is really not something that's worthwhile. You take risks in a system like that, and it would be very easy to find yourself under investigation by the NKVD for alleged counter-revolutionary activity, shall we say.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, the Soviet system was not designed to reward risk. Quite the contrary, they punished it severely. So the fact that Zhukov was able to take risks that were basically just necessary, he wasn't like a big gambler. He was just, a normal officer who was willing to take risks despite the fact that he was in a totalitarian system that did not reward it. And probably even more impressive, he was willing to tell the truth to Joseph Stalin even when it was not necessarily convenient, which is not something that pretty much any other officer was able to do without consequence. Yeah, pretty much the only reason Zhukov was able to get away with it is that he was quite well decorated and experienced. He had the chops. He'd proved himself in several battles over the course of the early part of World War II against the Japanese in Mongolia, and I think also in the Civil War. So he was sufficiently credentialed and respectable that Stalin was willing anyway to give him a pass, even if he did not necessarily agree with everything Stalin said. So that gave Zhukov room to maneuver that other officers didn't have, and that kind of allowed him to succeed where other officers had failed. Specifically, officers that were not as talented as Zhukov, but were more well politically connected and were more trusted by the establishment. So guys like General Vorozhilov, for example, who had been a general in the Russian Civil War, but had not really distinguished himself in the Civil War, but had principally distinguished himself more in his political reliability. He was basically Stalin's buddy. And so that was sufficient to get him a relatively high-ranking position in the Soviet regime, specifically also in the Red Army. And Vorozhilov was actually one of the guys responsible for the disaster at Kiev in 1941. Wait, am I getting that right? Yeah, 41. Battle of Kiev, the Soviets end up getting surrounded in Kiev, and 660,000 Soviet troops end up surrendering, which was a lot. That was a big number. And Vorozhilov and some of the other guys, some of the older generals in the Red Army at that time who were of sort of Civil War vintage, they really showed that they were not up to the job. Again, the fact that they were there for political reasons rather than because they were talented really showed in the early part of the war. And so that opened the way for more competent officers like Zhukov, who had been able to survive the purges, to come in and lead the Red Army more competently. If you want some more fun trivia there was another famous Russian general who was similar to Zhukov in that he was actually, competent, knew what he was doing. His name, if I'm remembering correctly, was Rakovski. And the fun thing about Rakovski is that when the war started, he was actually being tortured by the NKVD.
What's the NKVD?
Predecessor to the KGB.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, secret police.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, short history, when the communists first came to power in Russia, their secret police were called the Cheka.
Mm.
And even today, you can kind of the secret, well, not the secret police, but security institutions in Russia, shall we say, frequently still considered themselves Chekist in nature and culture. That is to say, institutional culture. They still derive their sort of institutional heritage from the norms and practices established by the Chekist secret police under the early Soviet Union, which is not really a good thing considering how violent and brutal they were, but that's a whole other discussion. So the Cheka eventually evolved into the NKVD. And then later on, after World War II, the NKVD evolved into what came to be known as the KGB. So they're all basically the same institution, but they had different names over the course of the early mid-20th century. But basically, secret police. So Rokosovsky had gotten caught up in the purges of the Red Army, and he was being investigated, tortured, etc. And almost certainly he was scheduled to be killed at some point. Everybody kind of knew that. But as happened, the Germans declared war, invaded the Soviet Union. And so instead of killing him, they gave him an opportunity to basically formally be recommissioned into the Red Army and lead troops. And, well, yeah, it's not really something you say no to, especially in his position. Yeah, it was particular. It was just really dramatic, like going from being on the verge of being murdered by secret police to being a Red Army general, and then going on by the end of the war to being one of the heroes of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. It's quite the turnaround. All the more so because the guy didn't have any fingernails left. That had been part of his torture. Yeah.
Wow.
I think his name was Constantine Rosovsky. I don't quite remember exactly. Yeah, the Red Army was a pretty wild place in the 1930s, and all the more so over the first couple years of World War II.
There was a question in the chat of kind of responding to you saying that a lot of Europe is skeptical of the Soviet Union and communism and stuff. How does that compare with the intellectual support of communism in the US? Because there are some Americans who do think communism is a good system. From my perspective, I don't think any of them think that the Soviet iteration of that was a good instance of communism to use as an example, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, keep in mind, I was talking like early mid-20th century, right? The interwar years leading up to World War II.
Yeah.
In that period in particular, with all of the violence, with all of the economic instability, with all of the ethnic dislocation and disturbances, extremist ideologies had a lot more currency. A lot of people blamed liberal Democrats of one kind or another for, if not causing World War I, at least being unable to kind of contain it. And then also for basically failing categorically to deal with the fallout of World War I. Capitalism in general was not in the good graces of the European body politic in the wake of World War I. So various anti-capitalist, anti-liberal ideologies, like fascism, like communism, had found fertile ground just all over the continent. Less so in Western Europe, just because it was relatively more prosperous and the political institutions were stronger. But basically, the weaker the institutions and the weaker the economic performance in other parts of Europe, the more likely they were to see extremist ideologies of one kind or another come to the fore. Mm-hmm. Yeah, extremism always does well when everything is going to shit. That's when people start doubting the status quo and start looking for alternatives. And, as the old saying goes, they frequently look for love in all of the wrong places. Mm-hmm. Results speak for themselves. It was not good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and liberal democracies, to their credit, while they were, again, the criticism that they were not able to manage very well in the early 20th century was, to a degree, well-founded, but the liberal democracies were able to adapt and eventually evolve into a new shape and form that had more legitimacy, and it was able to maintain the respect of most people in Europe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you saw the same phenomena play out after World War II, because, over the course of World War II, Europe was just absolutely devastated. And, one of the things that happened is that Germany got cut off from imports of raw resources, including food. And the result is that there were near famine conditions in a lot of Europe. People went hungry. A lot of, people lost a lot of weight, especially in the latter years of the war. And, if you talk to people who have family who's kind of still survived from that era, or maybe remember family from that era when they were younger, one of the stories that you'll hear is that their grandparents, who lived through that era, were kind of obsessed with food. They were always trying to feed them. Mm-hmm. I talked to a guy who came to University of Texas at Dallas. He was a grad student there at the same time I was, and we kind of hung out a little bit, talked. I took him to a ranch. We did some things together. And yeah, he told me that his grandparents were like, and also the grandparents of like his friends and whatnot, all kind of have a similar attitude, which is that, you need to eat well while you can.
Yeah.
They had just kind of this pathology about food and staying well fed.
Survivalism. Yep.
Yeah, when you know real hunger, and it sticks with you for a long time. That's a pattern I've seen with a lot of societies that have experienced famine conditions.
Yeah.
People take that shit very seriously, even after the famine conditions end. Like, there's a permanent fear and concern that just kind of underlies their psychology.
Then it makes sense.
Yeah, consider yourself, and everybody in the United States generally should consider themselves lucky that they don't have to deal with that. Obviously, some people have issues, taking care of themselves. There's certainly poverty in the United States, but we've never known those kinds of conditions. World War II Europe and post-war Europe, we don't really have an equivalent to that, fortunately. But yeah, things were bad, right? There was shortages of food. It took years for Europe's economy to really recover from the war. It was not like a light switch where the war ends and then, okay, everything is going to improve and get markedly better. No, like things were hard for years, even after everybody started trying to rebuild. And because things were so hard, there was a lot of people that were looking for alternatives. And obviously, fascism was not exactly in vogue in Europe after World War II. So that was no longer an option. But the status quo liberal political parties were also still kind of in the doghouse, so to speak. And so that kind of just left the communists. And so as a result, communism actually did experience something of a surge in popularity all over Europe after World War II. And of course, the Red Army and the Soviet Union were able to quite credibly claim that they had played a major effort and role in liberating Europe from, fascism and Nazism and, helping end the Holocaust and whatnot. So, they got a nice boon politically from that as well. Now, I would point out that while they did experience a surge in popularity, there were still plenty of people that hated communism more than anything. And, communists across Europe and the Soviets themselves had done quite a bit of, to encourage that sentiment. And it's not well, I think everybody knows how the Red Army behaved in, Eastern Europe and in particular in Eastern Germany after the war ended. So a lot of that just sort of reinforced a lot of negative stereotypes about communism generally, in addition to those about the Red Army. So yes, communism became more popular, but a lot of that was on the back of just generally shitty conditions. I think the famous quote from what was his name? I don't remember his name. He was an American general who was responsible for the American zone, the American occupation zone in Germany. And his statement was that there is no choice between there is no choice between food and starvation and communism for most people. I'm butchering the quote. I don't remember it exactly. But the gist of it is that, if people have to choose between communism and starving to death, they're going to choose communism.
Yeah.
And communism did seem to offer some relief to people at that time, in so much as it offered some degree of organization and some pathway to getting the food that they needed. Food was the main thing. It wasn't just about income or having nice luxuries or even things like having discretionary income and whatnot. It was just purely about survival for a lot of people in the post-war period. And Western democracy and capitalism did not seem to be cutting it to a lot of people. So it kind of came down to an unpopularity contest in a lot of countries, especially in Western Europe, between the unpopularity of Bolshevik totalitarianism and capitalist apathy, as you might call it. And there were some very near misses. I don't know if you've followed the political history of Western Europe in that period, but man, the communists came pretty close in some places. There was a big election in Italy in, I want to say, 1947. And it was neck and neck between the communists and the center-right political parties. And the communists only lost by like a couple percentage points. Like, it was very close. And the communists in France were also very popular in that period. This was the late 1940s, early 50s were pretty much the heyday of the French Communist Party. And there was genuine concern amongst, diplomats and elites in Washington and London that France could fall to a communist government that was just popularly elected. More fun trivia for you, it was explicitly concern over exactly that eventuality that led Washington and also London to align with the right wing of French politics in that period. And one of the manifestations of that support, which was thought necessary in order to maintain the popularity and legitimacy of the right-wing political parties in France in the late 40s, early 50s, was that there was some support for French efforts to maintain its empire, because there was quite a few conservatives in France at that time that considered the maintenance of the French Empire a core interest of France. And of course, you might be familiar with one of the territories that France was trying to keep under its thrall in this period. Perhaps you've heard of Vietnam.
Wow.
Yeah, so American involvement in Vietnam dates back to this period. Our involvement was not as heavy in the late 40s, but it grew significantly over the course of the 1950s. And again, that was explicitly because we were aligned with the right wing, because we were concerned about the popularity of communists in France in the late 1940s. So to a degree, you can ascribe U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and to a lesser degree, perhaps, the Vietnam War itself, to this period and to this political conundrum that the United States faced in trying to balance the interests of anti-imperialism, which had nominally been a part of the American foreign policy toolkit, had been a nominal objective of American foreign policy for a long time, balancing that with the new interests and realities of being a European power and trying to constrain the popularity of communists and communism in Western Europe. Which I would point out, as a further addendum, as we continue down this very long tangent, I would point out that the reason that the United States thought it necessary to contain communism was not just about containing Soviet influence, but about containing the Soviet Union itself. And this has to do with a very particular framing that was held in Washington and London and other capitals in Western Europe, as far as communism and the relationship between communist parties in the Soviet Union. So you have to keep in mind, this is something that changed later. So this sometimes confused people, later on in the Cold War itself, and especially now. People in this period, over the course of the 1930s and 40s, assumed implicitly that communist parties all over the world, and especially in Europe, were de facto controlled from Moscow. They saw them as avatars of the Soviet Union's government. And as such, they saw them as a threat, in so much as they could seize power in a country and effectively seize control of that country for Moscow. In other words, countries that were controlled by communists were seen as de facto annexed by the Soviet Union, even if they were not legally annexed by the Soviet Union itself. And that was a fear that was not unfounded. Lots of communists around the world basically swore fealty to Moscow. And the Soviet Union itself ran an institution called the Internationale. The Comintern, sorry. They ran an institution called the Comintern, which was dedicated to organizing communist parties around the world in order to propagate world revolution. They had shut that down, I think, by the late 20s, early 30s, sometime in that period. There was basically a shift in policy priorities. That kind of reflected the battle between Stalin and Trotsky. That's a whole other discussion. But the gist of it is that the Soviet Union had closed down the Comintern and had kind of stopped cooperating significantly with a lot of communist parties around the world, although they still exerted influence and encouraged people to recognize the common party line as set by the Bolsheviks. So there was influence, but not control. However, that nuance was not recognized by anybody in power, virtually anywhere. It was just implicitly assumed by elites all over the world, but certainly in Europe, that these parties were being directed by Moscow. And to be fair to them, that had been a pattern that had been replicated by the Nazis and fascists generally. When the Nazis wanted to annex Austria, they didn't just move their army in. They activated Nazi cells that had been set up in Austria and that had recruited, Austrian Germans themselves. And they started a whole campaign of, unrest, sabotage, etc., to kind of lay the conditions for Anschluss, for the annexation of Austria by Germany. And they did the same thing in the Sudetenland. There were ethnic Germans living in Western Czechoslovakia, and Nazi sympathizers amongst that German population were activated by the Nazi Party well before the Nazis moved in. So this idea that an ideology could motivate people to rise up and destabilize a government and try to allow a foreign country to seize power or annex it, that pattern had been established by the Nazis. And from the perspective of the West, the Bolsheviks were not seen as substantively different than the Nazis. Different ideology, but same totalitarian approach to governments and same predilection for expansionism. So the perspective was, to kind of summarize this, that the Soviets were just as expansionist as the Nazis, but they did it in a different way. Rather than justifying it in terms of ethnic nationalism and just sending armies across borders, the Soviets justified expansionism in terms of ideology and mobilized and seized power by mobilizing like-minded activists and political parties in target countries and using them to launch coups and to seize power in their countries and turn those countries over to the de facto control of Moscow. I know it all sounds kind of strange from a modern perspective, but that was just widely held belief amongst diplomats, politicians, like all of the people responsible for making major decisions in the West, kind of implicitly believed that was true to some degree. And so when you take that perspective, when you take that into consideration, a lot of the decision making in the 1940s and 50s and the early Cold War makes a lot more sense. When you assume that the Soviets, it was believed that the Soviets were trying to de facto expand into Western Europe under the guise of supporting coups by communist parties, you can see why Washington would then be concerned by the popularity of communist parties in Western Europe and why it would then prioritize trying to suppress them. Basically, they did not see them as like genuine political movements with grassroots support, but rather foreign-supported parties that were trying to seize power for the benefit of a foreign rival.
Yeah, it's a different approach than what Germany was taking during World War II, which was just direct conventional military conquering. You just take your military forces, you run over other people and take their stuff, and then you take control. Whereas this is more so like creating ideological swings in areas that will eventually expand your sphere of influence, but you're not directly running over the local military and claiming it as your own. So I think because the tactics were different, our response to it was different. And in addition to that, one of the major differences between Nazi Germany, World War II, and the Soviet Union is a lot of the Nazi ideology is about identity. It's about who they are. Like, they're the best, that's why they should conquer the world, versus the Soviet Union is more so how we do things. Like, our system is better, and that's why we want to expand and get more people into our system, because we think our system is the best.
Yeah, and that fact actually made the Soviets almost more dangerous in a way.
Well, yeah, because you can increase the group size more.
Yeah. The Nazis needed ethnic Germans. Soviets didn't need any kind of particular ethnic group. Anybody could be a communist. Mm-hmm. And so that gave them more vectors through which to infiltrate a society. Mm-hmm. And again, communist activists in this period did themselves no favors by, again, openly declaring that they were loyal to Moscow and were basically waiting for orders. One of the most surprising things I read when I was doing research on that podcast series I did on the Rio Treaty, the one I put up on SoundCloud, one of the most surprising things I read was that there was a leader of a union who was explicitly communist. He self-identified as such. And he actually told a journalist, which was then, printed in media, that he was totally loyal to Moscow and was waiting for their orders. And that was this is a guy in Brazil, right? So Brazil had just had like a communist uprising in Sao Paulo in the mid-30s. And there was a great deal of paranoia by, the establishment about the degree of Soviet influence amongst communists and, about communist activity in general in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And it was, quite a conservative right-wing country at that time. So, you would think a communist activist would show a lot of discretion and would try to move more quietly in pursuing their agenda. But no, this guy just came out and told God and fucking everyone that he was directly following the lead of the Soviet government, just confirming all of the paranoid assumptions of the establishment. That kind of stuff is what drives people crazy. Like, that's one of the reasons people were so paranoid over the course of the Cold War and before the Cold War about communism and Soviet influence. Like, there were just too many people who just confirmed all of their worst assumptions about them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, to be fair, again, the Soviets, they were definitely trying to influence communist parties around the world, and were trying to kind of use them as a vector for influence, but they were probably not trying to just like outright expand and seize control of countries. That's probably not the case. And sort of that disparity between the degree of Soviet involvement and the assumptions in the West amongst elites about the degree of Soviet involvement, that discrepancy drove the political left in the West absolutely insane. Like, people on the left didn't really believe that leftist sympathies in the body politic were due to foreign influence, certainly not, influenced by the Soviet Union. They just believed that their policies and their solutions to public policy problems were genuinely popular and were necessary in order to substantively deal with issues like, labor rights, quality of living, all that kind of stuff. And so when the right came out and said, oh, no, this is just a result of communist Soviet influence, and we need to try to suppress this as much as possible, that really radicalized a lot of people. And it led to kind of this spiral of mistrust and political violence in Europe that lasted, well into the 1980s and did not really fully resolve until the Cold War ended.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of Red Brigades?
Red Brigades?
Red Brigades, yeah.
No.
So actually, it wasn't brigades, it was Red Brigade, technically. But they were a communist terrorist outfit that operated in actually, it was Italy, I believe. And they perpetrated a number of terrorist attacks. There was a period of Italy's history over the course of the 1970s called the Years of Lead, in which there was a significant amount of political violence. Terrorist groups of both the far right and far left variety just went at each other, assassinating politicians, assassinating civil society figures, assassinating each other. It was quite a difficult period for Italy. And I think people kind of forget about that. People kind of assume that Europe has always been sort of this very wealthy, stable place, and they compare it favorably to the United States frequently, which has significantly bolstered its reputation in the eyes of many Americans over the past 30 years in particular. But that was not quite the case in the 1970s. Europe was definitely a violent place, maybe almost as violent, if not more violent, than the United States. And given gun violence in the United States, that's saying something.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in Italy, it was the Red Brigades. In Germany, they had the Red Army faction, which I think was also known as the Baader-Meinhof gang, something to that effect. And then France, of course, just had a genuinely popular communist party that had, a pretty good chunk of seats in their parliament. So that that precluded the need, at least the perceived need, amongst radicals in France for more violence. Also, French politics are inherently more confrontational anyway. Lots of protests, mass protests, strikes, what have you.
Yeah.
So the communists there were quite happy to work through that avenue, rather than overt terrorism like in some other countries.
Yeah, I think a lot of French identity since the French Revolution is anti-elite in some ways. So for them to have a communist party that has visibility and some amount of power makes sense.
Yeah.
Because you don't want monarchs taking power, aristocrats, or people who are basically in that same slot. That's one of the funny things about how we perceive wealthy elites in the United States versus we call people in Eastern Europe oligarchs, and there's usually a negative connotation with that. Like, oh, they're an oligarch, they're probably up to some shady shit. We've got Elon Musk and heckin' like Apple CEO and shit making fuckloads of money and being insanely wealthy and having a lot of power, honestly, over people's daily lives because they control the technology that we use and that kind of thing.
Yeah, they're immensely influential.
Yeah.
I think one of the real distinguishing characteristics of one of the reasons anyway, why people distinguish between wealthy elites and one or the other place is that political institutions in places like Russia, for example, offer a lot more avenue for that influence and power to be leveraged into substantive privileges above and beyond what can be had in some place like the United States, where political institutions are much stronger and much more autonomous. You're not technically above the law in the United States. You can get away with a lot more, but you're not above the law. That's not necessarily the case in a place like Russia. If you're a politically well-connected oligarch, then so long as you don't step over any red lines, as far as somebody like Putin, for example, you can probably do just about whatever you want, and may even be encouraged to do whatever you want. In so much as you're bringing revenue into the patronage network by engaging in this, that, or the other, shady illegal operation, or maybe even just legal monopolistic activity. That's a net benefit for the establishment. In the United States, institutions are stronger and geared differently. So, if you want to be a wealthy elite, you can do that, but you don't need to, align with some powerful political figure, some Putin-esque dictator. The American system gives you the discretion to basically do whatever you want anyway.
Yeah.
There's limits. You can't engage in explicitly illegal activity for the most part. But in general, your freedom of action is much greater here. Property rights are quite beneficial. The wealthier you are, basically. And so there's not nearly as much reason to engage in the kind of politicking that oligarchs in places like Russia usually get up to. So yeah, they have similar degrees of power, but the difference in institutions influences their behavior. And it's sort of the behavior and the role they play in their respective political systems that makes them substantively different. Which is why we tend to talk more negatively about Russian oligarchs than similarly wealthy and powerful people in the United States.
No, that makes sense.
Their Western equivalent does not have nearly as much of a chokehold on political power and the subsequent economic benefits that come from it as Russian oligarchs do.
Gotcha.
Yeah, since we're talking about Greece, we mentioned Greece earlier, right? So Greece was in the British sphere of influence, and that's why the Soviets, did not end up invading Greece and setting up a puppet government there. That was true for a while, but what happened is that after World War II, the British were just bankrupt. Their budget was their balance sheets rather were just awful, and they needed to find ways to cut money. And, probably most famous of those cost-cutting measures was pulling out of India, which they famously did at a very expedited pace. Before World War II, the talk about granting India independence was that it could be granted as early as the 1980s. After World War II, suddenly it had to be done in 18 months. So that really illustrates just how much the war changed priorities in London. It also helped that they had a Labour government again under Clement Attlee. They obviously had very different priorities from Churchill's government and from prior conservative governments generally. But in addition to cutting costs by pulling out of India, the British government also cut costs by reducing support to the Greek government. Because what happened after World War II ended is that Greek communists rose up against the government and a civil war started. And the communists in Greece were supported by communists in Albania and Yugoslavia, if I remember correctly. It was assumed at the time that the Soviets were also supporting them, but I think subsequent historical study has revealed that they actually were not. Moscow apparently was respecting that Greece was part of that British sphere of influence and were not interfering. But some of the smaller states in the area had no such qualms and were actually giving them arms and ammunition. It's worth pointing out, too, that during World War II, when Greece was occupied by the Nazis, there were, like with many countries in Europe, two different resistances. One was the nationalist resistance, and then the other one was the communist resistance. And it will probably not surprise you that they did not get along. Mm-hmm. They spent most of their time fighting the Nazis, but they also made sure to make time to fight with each other as well. And after World War II ended, there was some question about how a unified government could be created in which both resistance groups and their leaderships could be represented. And as you might imagine, those negotiations went nowhere and resulted in the Greek Civil War. So the British obviously supported the nationalist government, But that was an expensive endeavor, and eventually they just couldn't afford it anymore. And they said, hey, we would like to stay, but we really just can't. And they went cap in hand to Washington and basically politely said, hey, we would like it if you gave support to the Greek government, but regardless whether you do or not, we're leaving. So make of it what you will. And Washington was not entirely happy with that. They believed that it was partly Britain's responsibility to hold up stability in their sphere of influence, as it was then recognized. But since the British had made it apparent that that was not going to happen, Washington actually did mobilize what resources were necessary to prop up the Greek government. And the result is that the nationalists were eventually able to win the Greek Civil War, such as it was. And that intervention on the part of, that sort of indirect intervention anyway, on the part of the United States ended up being one of the first major such interventions by the United States in what was then the early emerging Cold War. It's also worth mentioning that the communists in Greece, and probably the radical left generally in Greece, has never really forgiven the United States for doing that. They've been pretty butthurt about it ever since, even right up to this day.
Bad enough that you shouldn't say you're an American tourist? Or not that bad?
It's probably, overall people care more about money than they do about, ideology. So, yeah, I probably don't care that much. But
pay your bill and don't be rude. You'll be fine, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, not that big a deal. It probably manifests more in the form of some degree of affinity and sympathy for Russia. Mm-hmm. I think everybody's pretty well aware at this point that it tends to be the radical left and radical right-wing parties and groups and movements in Europe that tend to be more sympathetic towards Russia. Mm-hmm. And have been for a couple decades now. It's similar in Greece. A lot of those old radical left-wing groups in Greece tend to have residual sympathy, you might say, for Russia, even though they don't really have anything in common anymore. Russia's pretty well moved beyond communism at this point. There's very little in common basically nothing in common ideologically between the present Russian state and government and the Soviet government, but I kind of feel sometimes like a lot of people on the radical left, if not also the radical right, have not gotten that memo.
They don't know. Horseshoe theory. The more to the extreme you get, the more similar you are to the other side.
Yeah, to a degree. Yeah, I remember when the war in 2014 happened, right, when Russia invaded Crimea and the Donbass. Mm-hmm. There were some, Vice News had their camera crews out, and they were, doing their thing back when they were still doing cool stuff like that. And I remember there were some foreign fighters that had actually volunteered to fight for the separatist republics in the Donbass. The Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. And two in particular I remembered were these two Spanish guys, guys from Spain. And they were sort of left-wing in outlook and Republican. I don't know if you're familiar with the Spanish Civil War, but it was very violent, and it featured basically the left wing of Spanish politics versus the right wing. That's a gross simplification, but that's basically what it was. And the Soviets actually supported the Republicans, the left wing, that is to say. And there's been some affinity on the part of the left wing of Spanish politics for Russia since then, to varying degrees. And these two guys said that they came out to fight because they saw the war in 2014 as a war against the West, Western imperialism and capitalism. Very much in keeping with that sort of older outlook as the Soviet Union as a redoubt, a bulwark, if you will, against Western imperialism and capitalism. I guess it didn't occur to them, or maybe they didn't know, or maybe they didn't care, that really the stronger current, in so much as there was any ideology involved in the conflict at all, the stronger current ideologically was just ethno-nationalism. Far left sentiments, socialism, communism, all of that stuff has been out of fashion in Russia for a long time. There's still people who support it. The Communist Party still has, substantive support, but it's basically been neutered like any other opposition party in Russia. At this point, their opposition is more symbolic than anything. The leadership has de facto been bought off, and they never really criticized the government in order to avoid making waves. They've got a nice, comfortable arrangement worked out, basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, kind of illustrating the fact that it was not like some kind of socialist revolt in Ukraine against some ultranationalist Nazis that had taken power as a result of Euromaidan. Case in point is the fact that one of the major militias in the early part of the war was a Russian ultra-Orthodox Christian fundamentalist militia, which is obviously quite the opposite of a socialist militia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there were like a couple socialist militias as well, but there were just as many like Christian fundamentalists as well. Yeah, I think they called themselves the Russian Orthodox Army or something like that. Yeah, there was a lot of weird groups active at that time. Basically, anybody who was a radical of any kind took the opportunity to mobilize and try to grab a little power and influence. Did not work out well for them in the end. As it happened, the Russian army moved in and basically cleaned out everybody and just installed some puppet leaders that had ties to the FSB to kind of run things in their stead. So a lot of the guys that had been early activists who had wanted an independent Donbass, or who wanted the Donbass to be annexed by Russia, a lot of those guys ended up getting sidelined. They were a little too unruly and unreliable for Moscow's liking. So a lot of them ended up getting cleaned out at one point, like Russian operatives of ambiguous origin and nature literally went to the capital of I think it was the DPR at one point. They literally went to the capital and kicked out everybody who was not directly controlled by the FSB. There was a lot of people who were butthurt about it. Vice News actually covered it, as I recall. I was actually just watching a documentary in which they were covering some of that. Yeah, there's a sense that Russia is still a redoubt against Western perfidy of one kind or another, but that's very much rooted in an older ideological debate in Europe that's kind of past its prime. The current politics has obsolesced beyond that. Current Russian politics are a mix of ultranationalism and revisionism. And to a degree, Christian conservatism. The Russian government has been trying to make Orthodox Christianity a thing. They've been investing a lot in churches and cooperating closely with the Orthodox Church in Russia.
Yeah, I even saw a headline that apparently the Orthodox Church in Ukraine still supports the Russian government, which some people are upset about.
It's a little more complicated than that. So what happened is that the Patriarch in Kiev was still technically controlled by the Moscow Patriarch, institutionally speaking, like
below him in the
organizationally.
totem pole. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And there was some disagreement about the degree to which the Kiev Patriarch was truly autonomous. Because, organizationally they're subservient, but nominally they're supposed to be autonomous. And basically what happened is that a number of priests in the in Ukraine generally, kind of said some things that were a little pro-Russia, a little skeptical of some of the events happening as far as the Ukrainian perspective went. And that set off a lot of alarm bells in Kiev. And so there was a movement then that did have support within the Kiev Patriarchy to break off the Kiev Patriarchy and make it independent from the Moscow Patriarchy. And that ended up happening. And the result is that there was a schism. Basically, the people in the Kiev Patriarchy that were still loyal to Russia kind of broke off and started doing their own thing, and then the pro-Ukraine faction, if you will, stayed loyal to the Kiev Patriarchy and aligned with them. So, the split between the Russians and the Ukrainians is reflected in this religious schism as well within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Gotcha.
So basically, some people are loyal to Moscow, yes, but that's exactly why the split happened. So that's kind of a division as a result. To be fair to Ukraine, the Russian government has very specifically and deliberately used the Russian Orthodox Church as a vector of influence. I would not go so far as to say Orthodox priests in the church are outright agents of Moscow, but they do tend to reflect the Russian government's message and politics. And so there is a degree of influence there that kind of curbs their independence to a degree sufficient to justify, to a degree, paranoia about just what their role is in places like Ukraine that are worried about Russian influence.
We did get a question that's kind of about influence, but not specifically this, of what is the role of music in influencing people for governments? Because it influences the amygdala, which is a very kind of old part of the brain, which means it's a very kind of primal and visceral way of impacting us and so forth. And I think it's kind of connected to just like, what is the power of propaganda and how is it used against us? There are definitely examples that come to mind as an American of like our national anthem, stuff like that, where it makes you think like good thoughts about your country. What lately has been, I guess, grabbing my interest more so than the power of song is the power of specific words, and how you can think of lots of different politicians who don't actually speak in coherent, complete sentences, but they say enough words of power that people eat it up, and they love listening to these people because there are enough mistakes in their speech that it makes them seem folksy and relatable. It's like you can talk for 2 hours saying not even a single really coherent and actionable policy or plan or thought, and just say freedom, jobs, freedom, jobs, freedom, jobs, freedom, jobs, or whatever the fashionable thing to do is, and you're going to get a lot of people who are very jazzed about what you're doing. I recently, just through travel and stuff, ended up being able to listen into a lot of Fox News, and I didn't really listen to other news networks to like give a side-by-side comparison, so take this with a grain of salt, but there's a lot of bashing of stuff that makes people feel smarter and better and more cool than whatever the opposition is. And that ends up giving those politicians basically just an unlosable position against the other side. Like you're almost never going to have someone who watches news that's that aggressive be like, you know what? I think I'm going to vote for the opposite party this time and see what happens. So I would be more wary of that, of watch for the kinds of words that politicians use and think about how coherent their message is overall. Like, what are they actually planning to do? Because for a lot of people, all they need to do is hit the buzzwords and make your brain light up, and you can't help but vote for them. And honestly, it's kind of embarrassing for educated people to be swayed by things like this, but charisma is a real thing, and people have fallen for charismatic leaders before. So if you've fallen for a charismatic leader who said some spicy words that made your brain light up, that's okay. Just try to really think about, what is this person going to be doing in terms of action for my country? What kind of example are they going to set? And how can I make sure that I'm not being basically just controlled by propaganda and other people trying to be really, I don't know, really spicy for clicks. That's another thing that's causing people to win in this area of mass media, is the spicier you are, the more likely you are to rise to the top. A lot of the really measured and intelligent and educated people who run for office, this isn't a diss at them, but they've got like very low charisma, so they're not fun to listen to. They've got very dry and simple responses to things. Maybe they stutter, maybe they have like something about them, maybe they're not as attractive as other candidates. And we do make a lot of these base, superficial judgments of people just based on how they look, because we don't have the time to know every single person's whole backstory. So yeah, I guess my thing that I'm curious about is these words of power and how they can influence people.
Well, you know, the trick to good propaganda is to tell people what they want to hear.
Yeah.
So it's not about lying per se, or, you know, misrepresenting. It's more about knowing your audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you tell people something that's an obvious lie that is meant to benefit you, people will pick up on that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you tell people an obvious lie that benefits them, certainly one that strokes their ego, they're generally willing to overlook that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most effective propaganda. Yeah, it just kind of goes with the grain, so to speak. Effective propaganda goes with the flow. It doesn't try to force things. It just kind of tells you that you're right. What you want is a good thing, and you should have it. And the people trying to prevent you from having it are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so long as you frame issues in that way, you can get away with just about anything.
Yep.
You want X, the other guy doesn't want to let you have X. If you let me do Y, I'll give you X.
Mm-hmm.
Very simple. Doesn't matter if you have no feasible way to actually deliver X, or if Y doesn't have anything to do with X at all. So long as you're giving people what they want, people will be inclined to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
This is a problem in all political systems. And it's just one of the inherent flaws with democracy that people have been talking about since, ancient Greece. It's just inherently difficult to deal with charisma and politicians who know their audience well enough to know what to say, to compel people to support them. Well, maybe not compel, but to draw people to them. That would be the better way to say it.
It's been interesting too, seeing a negative approach to building clout, and that's probably always been a thing, but it feels like it's been much stronger in the past few decades, where rather than have a really cohesive battle plan for what you're going to do with the keys to power once you have them, is utterly bludgeoning and bashing the opposition so hard that they are an untenable option in the eyes of the voters, which is kind of weird because, like, once you win against those people who you say are so bad, what will you do then? And you don't even really have to do that much if you've sufficiently demonized the opposition. That was one of the things that I found really interesting about how Trump crushed the Republican primary so hard, was he basically had an enemy profile on everyone he was running against. He had a stupid nickname for them so that anyone who thought about that person would think, man, they're just so much worse than him because they've got these key problems. And it's a strategy that absolutely worked.
Yeah, it was impactful. But, the most important thing to always remember about Donald Trump is that fundamentally he is a political free rider. He is very much free riding on political forces that were already being mobilized and already present before 2016. Right, that was already present. Like, all of the mistrust that has characterized American politics over the past 20 years, that was already accumulating. It's been said before, and I'll say it again here, Trump is a symptom, right? He's not like the disease. He's just a symptom of overarching mistrust in American institutions by broad swaths of the U.S. body politic.
Yeah, we were dealing with a situation of very low voter satisfaction with the current government. So if he's talking different and acting different, then people are going to think change good in general. That makes sense.
Yeah, the government just has lied about so much stuff for the past 50 years.
Yeah.
There was all the lies about Iraq, and even before that, Vietnam. Vietnam is generally credited. This is some trivia for you guys not from the United States. There's probably just a handful of you listening, but for those of you who are not American listening, if you only remember one thing I say tonight, remember this. The Vietnam War is generally credited in the United States for destroying the credibility of the U.S. government amongst the U.S. body politic. There had always been people suspicious of it before, even hateful of it, but the Vietnam War in particular spread that malaise, spread that mistrust against a broad swath. Like, even people in the middle class who had generally been moderate and were generally willing to give leaders the benefit of the doubt after the Vietnam War, that was not a thing. It became much rarer. And it's only been downhill since then. And the Iraq War was just as bad in that regard. So there was lots of lying about that. There was lies about, international trade. Trade agreements kept getting passed, like NAFTA, and China's accession to the WTO. That was also negotiated. All of that stuff was said to be disruptive, but beneficial to the overall economy. And that if any one community suffered disproportionately, then the government could do something to compensate those people and smooth out the edges. And none of that happened, right? I mean, it was beneficial to the overall economy, just going by the raw numbers. But the level of disruption and dislocation amongst many an established industrial community was significant, and the government did very little to try to manage it. To be fair, it wasn't as bad as some people make it out to be. Like, the reality, according to a study that I read anyway, a lot of the people who had lived in those communities actually did end up moving to other places and finding new jobs. So if those communities look exceptionally bad now, keep in mind that the people who still live there are just sort of disproportionately bad off. Those were the ones who were the least able to find alternative work, or who were the least able to relocate for whatever reason, be it cost or family ties or whatever. So a lot of people were able to move, and there were economic benefits. But in general, like the government did not do enough to try to help people. And the result was a huge amount of bitterness in those communities. And that was a big draw, for a lot of people, for a lot of radical parties anyway. A lot of people were attracted to radical messages on account of that, because the establishment parties, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, were just thoroughly discredited at that point, because neither party even really recognized a lot of the time that there was a problem, that people were struggling. And then when they offered solutions, they were half solutions or token solutions. And it was very apparent after, various solutions had been implemented that they weren't working, and that nothing substantive was really being done to try to rejuvenate these communities that had suffered deindustrialization and suffered from international trade. And that itself, built up a huge amount of enmity towards the establishment political parties. There's just so many people that were marginal in the political system to the point where they were largely just ignored and felt like they weren't important, that, the door was just wide open to some kind of radical populist of one kind or another. So yeah, all of the lying had consequences. It took a couple decades, but eventually they happened.
Yeah.
And now that we're seeing the consequences, we're learning that it's not going to be easy to roll back those consequences.
Yeah, it's harder to build trust than it is to destroy it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's going to take a long time. And it's going to take governments that take governance seriously, that do a good job of building a rapport with the public. Politicians with charisma are needed to try to restore faith in the political system. And also politicians who have charisma, who are willing to use it to good ends, such as rebuilding public trust in institutions, rebuilding basically the administrative legitimacy of the American government. And unfortunately, we're not really getting those guys right now. In the random event generator of history, America really needed a great leader to kind of navigate it through what is a very difficult period of history. And instead, we got Caligula. You can't win them all.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens. Maybe we can get better leadership, or maybe there can be some other broader changes in the overall structure of American politics and the balance of power between different groups that results in some kind of better and more positive trajectory. But for now, we're very much riding the whirlwind that we sowed in previous decades.
So we'll see what happens. I already saw posts about people interfering with elections. The left is accusing the right of interfering, and the right is accusing the left of interfering. So there's a lot of interference. A lot of accusations going out. Yeah, we vote for president in November, right?
Yeah, November next year.
Yeah.
It's going to be an adventure.
Yep.
I'm not looking forward to it. Cursed to live in interesting times.
Yep. We live in the silly timeline.
I'm hopeful if we can survive this, that, the younger generation will sort of learn just through evolution, just through being subjected to the experience, learn the value of trust in good institutions, good governance, etc., and we'll start voting accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe all of this will have the upshot that eventually we'll have a generation come of age that really sees the benefit of stability and the benefit of bland, predictable politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were able to free ride on it for a long time. We were able to free ride on the generation of people that grew up in the 1930s and 40s. That was a generation that knew how to appreciate stability.
Mm-hmm.
They knew the value, and they took it very seriously. It's to their credit that they were able to maintain the norm that foreign policy would be debated in Washington, but once agreed would be propagated regardless of administration. Even if there was a change in power, it was recognized that the credibility of America's position in the world was dependent on having consistency in foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so even when Democrats and Republicans came into power, they would still largely maintain the foreign policy of their predecessor, making changes here and there, but there were no dramatic breaks. All of the commitments that the previous president had made would generally be respected. in order to maintain American credibility.
Yeah, just from my individual citizen's perspective, any new president coming in might change like one or two things about how my life tends to go. A lot of people's opinions and emotions can change dramatically, but the overall standing of the country on the planet doesn't usually change that much. And I think that's partly due to the depth of the executive branch as a unit, where it isn't just the one person. The one person definitely holds a lot of sway, and maybe you could argue the most in the country, but the people behind them. This is kind of how I explain Biden, where Biden isn't ever someone who I was excited to vote for. I don't really consider myself a fan of him, but I think a lot of people just ended up throwing a vote in his direction because they're like, well, this has a lot of the same people as the Obama administration had, so I assume that it will be a sort of cautious and middle of the road set of policies for a Democratic candidate. So you vote for that person, but you don't actually feel like you're a huge fan of them. And I think that's the thing that Trump did better than him, was create more of a persona that is magnetic, that a lot of people are excited about, and how that's a really hard thing for a politician to succeed in both of those categories, to have the showmanship of being able to talk a big game, but then also having a solid team behind you that gets the stuff done that you're talking about doing. And it's pretty rare to have both of those in a politician at the same time.
Yeah, and when it happens, they tend to be pretty memorable.
Yeah.
They're generally pretty effective. But we are not spoiled for choice right now. Yeah, lots of difficult decisions for the American public at this point. Yeah, part of the problem Biden also has is that he's leading the Democratic Party, which has a much more unwieldy coalition than the Republican Party. I think we've talked about it before. But just the different political groups that comprise the Republican Party are inherently more alike than the different parts and constituent groups that form the Democratic Party. And so that makes it easier for the Republican Party to generate charismatic candidates, because it's a lot easier to have just one message that you can use that works pretty well on all of the constituent groups you're trying to appeal to. Democrats find that much more difficult, right? Because on the one hand, they're the party of organized labor, but then they're also the party of ethnic minorities, and they're also the party of the progressive urban middle class. And all of those groups are, to varying degrees, kind of at odds with each other. They don't really have a whole lot in common. So if you want to create a charismatic message that really mobilizes them and excites them, you basically can't do that without alienating one or the other group. And so that's part of the reason why the Democratic Party tends to be a lot more bland in a lot of its policy making. It only really gets interesting if you get at local politicians, because generally local constituencies are more homogenous. And so that makes it easier to have one exciting message that can appeal to everybody you need to appeal to and still win. So you get people like Ocasio-Cortez, for example. She's very exciting. She says things that people really like online, and so people, really kind of hold her up as what they want. But a politician like her cannot lead the Democratic coalition. There are too many people in that coalition who would not want to follow her and do not want her kinds of policies, certainly not to the degree she would want to implement them.
Also, a random thing, because we're talking about influence and propaganda and that kind of thing. One of the other things that I've noticed, and chat, correct me if I'm wrong about this, it looked like the way that they visually present their people on Fox News is they're very conventionally attractive people. Basically, everyone on the show is hot to someone. This is what it seemed like to me. And these are news people, right? Which, if you're in front of the camera, like, looking good does have value. So that makes some sense. But, yeah, it just seemed almost weird. But it's a valid tactic. It's just one that I don't know if the end user is aware of that. Like, do people who watch the show know that that's maybe part of the reason they watch or not? I'm not sure. But that did stand out to me. I didn't watch the other news networks because I don't watch news TV normally. So if it's on in my environment, like at the airport or if someone's house has it on or whatever, then I will listen to it. But yeah, maybe CNN, MSNBC, whatever the liberal TV show platforms are, maybe they also do that. I just didn't check. So don't know about it. But that's a big shift that I think you mentioned was part of the 24-hour TV cycle, where news used to just be after people got home from work, they would get a quick report on what happened that day, and then goodbye, the TV is over. And you just don't have TV to watch. Whereas now you have a lot of time to fill. And you do have big, impactful news things that happen, but it's not really enough to just fill the 24-hour news cycle. So you got to like do some comedy pieces, have some fluff stuff, have some opinion pieces, which there just wasn't room for in the old way of doing news.
Well, I would say, to be fair, to previous generations of journalists, that kind of model of journalism is not new.
Mm-hmm.
It was just television, as you say, was just too limited in its early days to really facilitate kind of that more dramatic style.
Mm-hmm.
Like you say, they didn't have 24-hour news. But what they did have is newspapers. Those were much more popular than television news for a long time. Even as television got popular, like newspapers were still like the main source of information for most people. And even with newspapers, you would see them taking kind of what you might call like a Fox News model of journalism, where they tended to be kind of a little more salacious, a little more sexy. I remember I was reading something. I was doing some research on it using Time Magazine's archive, and I remember there was one article, just like a little sliver, like a little couple paragraphs, where one of the authors was making fun of the Chicago Tribune for having found a way to relate a story to sex, which apparently they had something of a reputation for. The Chicago Tribune, for those of you who don't know, was like the main conservative news outlet in early mid-20th century America. In the media landscape, like the Chicago Tribune, the newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, was like the lodestar of conservative media. And interestingly, their kind of approach to journalism was pretty similar to the way that Fox News approaches it. So what Fox News does and started doing, when 24/7 news became a thing, is not actually new. It's basically just a modernization and adaptation of a previous model that had previously existed only in print.
Oh. That makes sense. I would say our mental wiring to be drama-seeking has always existed, so it makes sense that that would be capitalized on basically as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an effective model.
Let's blame Gutenberg. If you didn't make the damn printing press, people would actually have to take the time to write shit down.
Yeah. Let me ask you something, Neuro. In all the time that you spent watching Fox News, did you ever see a brunette woman?
Yeah, there were a couple. It was
Really?
definitely not as represented, but yes, there was at least one that I saw.
At least one?
Yeah.
Yeah, platinum blonde is pretty much de rigueur.
Yeah.
If you're going to be on Fox News.
Yeah.
My grandfather used to watch it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And since I lived with him for a long time, I used to kind of see it on in the background quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I kind of made a mental note every time I walked by of whether or not there were any brunettes on screen.
That's so funny.
Very rare. Almost always platinum blonde.
Uh-huh. Well, I can't talk too much. I'm dating someone who's platinum blonde. She does have some highlight other colors in there, but...
Hey, I don't knock blondes.
Yep.
Whatever they want to do, but
they definitely
Fox
have
News in particular.
A particular fixation, yeah.
Yeah. That was purposeful too. That was no coincidence. That was an editorial choice by the producers working for Fox News. They went out of their way to do that.
And you're applying for a job there. It's like, hey, I want to be a news anchor. Okay, good. What's your hair color? It's brunette. Actually, it's about to be blonde.
Yeah. Yeah, the Communist Party does something similar. They actually require all of their senior officials to dye their hair black.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's why you never see Communist Party officials with gray hair in China.
Huh.
They're actually required to dye it.
I did not know that.
Yep. Makes them look younger, more vibrant.
Yeah. We should get the powdered wigs back.
There you go. Simplify the whole process.
Yeah. I think that was during like a syphilis problem or something, where a lot of people were getting that and they would lose their hair and they didn't want to be embarrassed. So it's just like, all right, the people in power have this disease or whatever, so we want to make sure they don't look uncool, so everyone else is going to wear powdered wigs too, just to be in the fashion.
Yeah, fashion can be practical at times.
Fuzzy Cord quoting the song, "'Cause I'm a blonde, yeah, yeah, yeah." Have you seen Earth Girls Are Easy? It's like a late 80s, I think 1989 or something it came out.
Is that the one with Jeff Goldblum in it?
Yeah, and Jim Carrey. Like, it's one of his first movies.
Yeah. I've seen parts of it, but I've never sat down and watched the whole thing.
It's pretty funny. I watched it with Trisha a couple months ago.
Oh, cool.
I'd never heard of it before. It does have adult themes, so I can see why I wasn't allowed to watch it as a young lad. There are a bunch of those movies that I was never allowed to watch and I hadn't seen until recently, like Starship Troopers, because there's a booba. But that was a good movie.
God forbid anybody in America see a boob.
Yeah.
Want to see a guy get ripped in half by an insectoid alien? That's fine.
Yeah. But breasts? Nope.
Yeah, good old Paul Verhoeven.
What? Who's that?
He's the director of Starship Troopers.
Oh, gotcha.
He was known for making ultraviolet movies in that vein. RoboCop.
Ah.
He directed that. Total Recall.
Uh-huh.
That was another one he did. I think he also did Call Girls. I don't know if you remember that.
I don't know what that one's about.
I think it was supposed to be about prostitute in Las Vegas or something. I don't know. It was supposed to be kind of salacious, and it turned into a huge disaster. It's considered like one of the worst films to have been made. Yeah, it is not remembered fondly. Definitely not one of his better works. Showgirls, that's what it. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord. Oh, I forgot. I should do the usual disclaimer. I forgot to do it last time.
Oh, no. So people thought you knew everything you talk about?
It's bad karma not to. No, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. So I always want to make sure to throw that out there so that nobody thinks that I'm secretly trying to brainwash Neuro into the far right. At least one person on YouTube seems to have that impression.
Wait, they thought you are?
That's what... Did you not see that comment?
Hang on. No, that's great. Yeah, just for like full transparency, I'm definitely a more left-leaning person for most of my policies, especially like social ones. Like if you're LGBT, go live your best life. I'm not threatened by any of that. Fiscally, like on a personal level, it's always nice when you don't have to pay as much tax personally, but I understand the purpose of needing to pay taxes for things to keep the country going and that sort of deal. But one of the things that I like is whenever a candidate goes against their party sometimes just to show that they have some autonomy. And it's pretty rare for a politician to do that. I think I voted for McCain actually when that was my first election to vote in, I think. Because he was kind of purpley in the sense that he ran under the Republican Party, but he was a contrarian for a lot of issues, and he would go against certain stuff even after he ran for office. So I like that kind of energy. He had the whole Maverick brand. I think he was a little bit past his prime to have the charisma to win, but that's something that I wish was more celebrated for people who run for office, is whenever they join a party and they're enough of that alignment that they can get votes, but they also have some individuality of, okay, I'm actually going to disagree with you guys on this issue. What it seems like currently in the landscape is you just bash your other people who are running against you in your party, which seems a little bit self-defeating if you're talking shit about your own party a whole bunch, but we live in strange times.
But it were otherwise.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry for brainwashing you, Neuro. That's on me.
That's okay. I try to be aware of attempts to wash my brain. The brain does a lot of its cleaning and stuff while you sleep. So, Chad, if you're feeling like you've got brain fog and you're not performing the best mentally, try to make sure you're caught up on sleep, because that's a big part of your mental health, is just being well rested and being able to restore yourself. I would not have guessed that they would think that you were trying to sway me to the right. One thing that can happen with this live stream platform, and also for if they scrub through a YouTube video, is sometimes you can be talking about a situation just in a neutral capacity of this is what this person said, and a new viewer who dives in might think that you're like going to bat hard in agreement with that and trying to persuade people, which that's not really how you do things, and you've never been like that. Like, I don't think you've ever tried to sell me on anything in particular. It's just like, this is what I found out, make of it what you will, which is a really nice breath of fresh air. Appreciate that. I have met people who have definitely tried to sway me in one direction or another, and it's kind of fun. I like when people are enthusiastic about things and they have passion. That's cool. Glad you have a strong feeling about this issue.
Yeah, what was it? He mentioned the Koran burnings, I think was one thing he talked about. Yeah, it's not the Koran burnings that are funny. It's the fact that it's keeping Sweden out of NATO. Like, of all the things that would keep Sweden out of NATO that I might have predicted, in 2022, successive burnings of the Koran in public would not have been among them.
Yeah, I was trying to tell people last time that that's part of Scandinavian culture, is burning Abrahamic tradition stuff. They've been doing this since the black metal scene in 1991. They've been burning churches, they burn stuff. That's just the way that they protest ideologies that they don't agree with. So I don't know why they feel so special and singled out, because they're not. They took their stabs at Christianity as well.
Well, some of the groups burning them are far right groups, so maybe that's what they're upset about.
No, maybe.
Maybe that's what they're homing in on. But they always do that. It's no shock. And some of them have been converted Muslims. Well, maybe not converted, but Muslims who had abandoned the faith, basically become atheists.
Oh yeah, ex-Muslims.
Yeah, there you go. So there's different people who have different reasons for burning Korans in Sweden and being skeptical of Islam. It's not any one particular group per se, although the far right probably is more predominant.
Sweden is creeping to the right from what you've been told. I think that tends to happen, though, whenever there's a huge immigration wave, just because people get defensive of wanting to maintain their own culture, and they feel like they're being, I guess, ideologically invaded in a sense, or they're being told to be different than they have been. And if they feel their traditions are threatened, then they'll get more nationalistic and defensive. I think that's pretty normal. And Sweden took on a whole bunch of refugees. That was one of the things that they did that some other countries didn't do to the same extent. So it makes sense.
Yeah, I was reading in the news recently that there was a big upsurge in killings, like gang-related killings in Sweden, specifically in one particular city. And the Swedish government is actually considering sending in the army to try to help the police deal with it. Yeah, there has been like something of an upsurge in violent crime in Sweden. And it has been linked by a lot of people, certainly on the far right, with immigrant communities. So that's definitely helped kind of incentivize and encourage some of that rightward shift they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, anti-immigration has kind of is becoming anyway, sort of the new norm in European politics. It's increasingly sort of the median position, just because of some of the fallout from having so many refugees, and as well as just the general discontent with conditions right now. I don't think it's as much of a problem with Ukrainian refugees. People seem to kind of give them a pass. I think the bigger issue is more, say, the Middle Eastern refugees. They seem to receive most of the ire of a lot of right-wing anti-immigrant type movements.
Yeah. I think you could just generally say the more different the immigrant community is from the local community, the more friction there's going to be. And that can be ethnically or religiously or whatever.
Yeah, unfortunately so. Or maybe fortunately. I guess that does make things easier if you are in a group migrating that is sort of similar in cultural preferences and outlook to the people in the country you're moving to. So Mexican migration into Texas, for example, has actually gone smoother than I think a lot of people expected it would. Because a lot of the Mexicans moving to Texas have been pretty rural conservative people who have sort of political preferences and outlooks that are actually very similar to a lot of conservative Texans' perspective. So that's actually eased the transition and the process of assimilation considerably, I would argue. Speaking as a Texan, I think I can say that with some authority.
Yeah, there was a documentary about that with Danny Trejo.
Oh, God.
Machete.
Yeah, I still need to watch that.
I was telling Trisha about that movie because it is a comedy. It's like an action/comedy, but it does point out like a lot of the fundamental issues with the like attitude of hatred toward immigration, but then also the Texas economy's reliance on immigrant labor to do stuff like build houses in the Texas heat and stuff like that, and how it's sort of a win-win where the migrant workers get more money than they would get in Mexico, and the Texans get more house for cheap. So both sides are winning, kind of a sort of deal. Yes, funny movie. I would recommend it.
Yeah, it's on my to-do list along with a multitude of other things. A despairingly long list my to-do list is.
A massive movie list.
Oh, yeah. I'm never going to finish watching all of it. There's just too much stuff out there now. The backlog is too big. I've still got to watch, season 2 of Strange New Worlds that came out this year.
Ooh. Nice.
Yeah, they just wrapped up not too long ago. I prefer to binge, so I was going to plan on, I was going to wait until the end of the season anyway. But I'm probably, it's been over for a couple months now and I still haven't done it. So I'm looking forward to that. There's all the movies I need to watch. I still haven't seen Die Hard.
The first one?
None of them. I still haven't seen any Die Hard movies, yeah.
First one's very good.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah, it's a family tradition that we watch it around Christmas.
Well, I don't think we really fully answered that one guy's question. He was asking about support for communism in the United States. That's what it was, right?
Yeah.
There's virtually no support for communism in the United States. That's just not really a thing anymore. You can certainly find policies that would have been popular with communists that have a lot of currency. There's plenty of people that want significantly more government activity as far as managing the economy and providing services. But as far as, liberal democracy just being a front for the bourgeoisie to dominate society, and as far as trying to set up a vanguard of the revolution to create a despotic one-party state in order to shepherd the people into a glorious post-capitalist communist utopia. No, nobody believes that. I don't think anybody would even really recognize that rhetoric. Under 30, that's probably very unfamiliar dialogue. It would have been very familiar 30, 40 years ago, but now I think politics and political discourse has largely moved beyond it. Some of the core ideas that were popular are still around, but the overarching ideology has kind of been abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And to give some meta commentary on that, I would argue that that's kind of been an overarching trend in a lot of countries around the world over the past couple decades in general. That being that individual ideas have been sort of parsed from the ideologies from whence they came. Historically speaking, that's not unusual, but what's unusual about the past couple decades is just the degree to which ideology has basically melted away and become just so amorphous as to be meaningless. Today, politics really seems to me just to be kind of a random medley of different ideas that don't necessarily have much ideological coherence with each other. Politics in the United States in particular has really just broken down into different interest groups competing with each other of one kind or another. It's always been like that. That's not necessarily new, but it used to be, especially in the mid-20th century, that there was an ideological overlay which parties tried to provide in order to justify their vision for the world and their preferred policies. Now I don't really see that so much. Maybe the closest to real substantive ideology that still exists is maybe nationalism, traditionalism, maybe some broad, vague notion of democratic socialism. But other than that, it's kind of hard to pin down any kind of real substantive ideology that seems to be thriving in the modern era. It really is just a lot more ideologically chaotic.
Wokeism. It's so funny how much of a buzzword that is now.
Which word?
Woke.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not an ideology, though.
It's not, but some people think of it as such.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, people think a lot of things.
That's true. Just take that quote.
Yeah,
people think a lot of things. Agent Smith, 2023.
Yeah, there you go.
There are too many clowns in the American political landscape for me to keep up with all of them. Agent Smith, 2022.
Well, I mean, just even saying that there's not any ideology anymore probably could start an argument. That itself would be controversial, specifically for the reason you point out, which is that people perceive ideologies like wokeness or, like Trumpism. But these are not coherent ideologies.
No.
They're just sort of labels that people attach to these, well, really just to individual ideas or policies. If something seems like it's something you don't like or that fits vaguely with a given movement, then you can kind of label it something. To a degree, the fact that we've come to rely on labels like that so much is indicative, I would argue, of the fact that ideologies are kind of dying. Because these labels are just very unwieldy and imprecise, but we seem to need some kind of framing, some kind of labeling, in order to try to make sense of what is an increasingly chaotic political environment.
Yeah, it's kind of made me want to run for office and just have a super utilities-oriented platform that everyone can agree on. Hi, my name's Austin Filsinger, and I'm running for fast internet and clean water. If you enjoy fast internet and clean water, vote for me. Because I will focus on literally nothing else than those two things if that's what I'm running on.
That's going to be a local office.
Yeah.
That's a lot harder to do at the higher level offices.
Yeah, I know. The countries attack you, and there's lots of drama you have to respond to. Being president is hard.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're going to be what do they call them? There's a lot of one-issue voters, single-issue voters. They have one thing that mobilizes them, but you can't really do that in office. Yeah. And not just because there's other responsibilities, but also because if you try that, you're going to be wide open to manipulation. If there's one particular issue that you're not very familiar with and you're just and are disproportionately dependent on advice and expertise for, you're going to find a lot of people who are offering it. And a lot of the times it's going to be very self-interested, quote unquote, advice.
Yeah. They're going to
give having advice. Having a plan for all policy areas is pretty well necessary. Because if you don't, you're going to get manipulated to the nth degree. That was one of the problems that Trump had when he was in office. He basically had no real plan, near as I could tell, when he was in office.
I thought his plan was to build a wall.
Yeah, there was a slogan. Yeah, no shortage of slogans. But in terms of actual substantive policy ideas, he kind of seemed to be making it up as he went along for the most part. And so that left him open to any number of manipulators. And, you know, from what I was reading, like his position on given issues could change by the hour, depending on who he last talked to. Because he just had no policy background, right? He depended on people to kind of inform him and tell him like what the best way to do something was. And so all of these hucksters and manipulators just descended on him and had him swinging all kinds of different ways, depending on, you know, who he talked to.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why having an inexperienced politician in office can be a big disadvantage. Because the more experienced you are and the more expertise on given issues you have yourself, the more defense you have against that kind of manipulation.
Yeah. That's
Say
a good
what you
thing.
will about. Go ahead.
Good thing to assess about when you're running. If you run for something, you know that you're going to have policies that you don't really have a personal stake in, that some people are going to have a very strong opinion about, and they're going to want you to do something about it. And if you don't, then that's basically kind of like giving the other side a favor. So you are, by not acting on something, sort of picking a side.
Yeah, inaction can be as impactful as proaction, as being proactive. So you can't kind of wash your hands of an issue by not doing anything about it and expect to avoid opprobrium. That's not how politics works.
Yeah.
Especially not in foreign policy. In foreign policy, if you intervene, you're blamed for whatever happens, and if you don't intervene, you're blamed for whatever happens. Why didn't you stop it?
If you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're not going to save, you know, yourself and avoid conflict by trying to be, say, isolationist, for example. You know, I think the mistake isolationists make is to assume that if the United States, which is, you know, generally where the isolationist is kind of more prominent in politics, you know, if we just stay out, then people will leave us alone, and that's not how it works, like anywhere. I mean, for one, even if you're not intervening militarily, you're still trading with other countries. You're giving them supplies, equipment, probably weapons. And if that's the case, then you're inherently disproportionately benefiting who you're trading with. Because presumably they're getting some benefit of buying that stuff from you. So whoever their opponents are, whoever the opponents of the people buying from you are, they're going to resent you selling to them. And they're going to demand you do something about it. And if you don't, they're going to say that you're culpable in whatever the actions of their rivals are. So isolationism is not going to insulate you against foreign conflict. You're going to be involved any which way you slice it. Even if you sanction a country, even if you say, hey, we're not going to trade with this particular group in control of this country because we don't want to be seen to be helping them. Well, by doing that, you're helping that group's rivals, right? The group that's not in power. If they see you sanctioning their rivals, they're going to think you're supporting them. And certainly the government in power is going to think you're supporting the opposition. So at that point, you're still involved. Like, there's nothing you can do to not be seen to be involved to some degree. And if you're a country as powerful and influential as the United States, with trade that spans the entire planet, forget about it. Like, there's no way you can't have an impact. You know, the United States is just too big not to have an impact some kind of way in virtually every corner of the world. So in that sense, inaction is no insulation at all to involvement. You're going to be held culpable by somebody, one way or the other. You know, in that sense, that's an argument in favor of being proactive in foreign policy. If you're going to get blamed anyway, you might as well try to shape events in a way that are at least more favorable. If you do nothing, then you're basically just conceding the field to people who are not going to shape the field in a way that's favorable to you. And you may not like what that looks like in 20, 30 years down the line.
Sounds harder than I envisioned it being.
Well, hey, I mean, if you want to run for local office, then yeah, you probably could do something like kind of really narrow and focused. You know, high-speed internet. The other thing,
internet, clean water.
Clean water. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, get the lead out of the water in Flint, Michigan. There you go. I'm sure they would appreciate that. People don't like it when their children are poisoned.
Yeah. That's something we can all agree on.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I hope for throughout at least some point in our lifespan is more stuff that we can all agree on and kind of rally around, because there have been periods like that. Usually it's periods of great strife where we end up grouping up because we have to. But yeah, a lot of division much of the time.
Unfortunately so. So I don't read chat while I do this, but I will read it later. But I've also got Twitch open here, and I saw some of the comments earlier, and I noticed some people were saying that the United States should have a more European political system, where we have individual political parties for individual constituencies. So, instead of having these big umbrella parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, we would have a party for the progressives, a party for, conservative, national hawks, libertarians, what have you. So, a party for every political group and ideology. And you can do that. I would argue that would be feasible. Probably the politics of actually changing the Constitution to change the electoral system to make it feasible are probably not viable. But, it could be done, hypothetically. I think, though, that people who want that would be disappointed by the result. Because the people who most want that are generally the people who think that if we did that, then it would result in a substantive change in political outcomes. And that's probably not going to happen. Like I said earlier, the two political parties in the United States are themselves umbrella organizations that bring together into a coalition a variety of different groups, movements, and political preferences. And if you break the Democratic and Republican parties up into smaller parties, what you're going to end up with is coalition governments, in which those same constituencies basically end up in the same coalitions they are now, but in a slightly different mechanical arrangement. When I say mechanical arrangement, I just mean like an electoral system where parties have to negotiate with each other to share power and reach a majority in a parliament. That's the mechanism in which a lot of European countries have multi-party systems. That's the way they function. So if you did something similar in the United States, most likely you would end up with the same coalitions you have now, and probably very much the same style of politics that we have now. It probably would not change a whole lot, would be my guess. Now, if you change the electoral system radically to be less dependent on first-past-the-post systems and to be less, shall we say, wedded to geography, as the current system is, that could result in some changes. But in a country as big as the United States, that is as decentralized as this country is, and with so many people in the United States dead set opposed to having a strong central government, you're not likely to end up with significant electoral reforms that result in a single national parliament in which everybody, that is to say, everybody in the country as a whole, votes members into. We're almost certainly going to always have a federal system in which representatives are selected from subnational entities, the states, in other words. And so that's inherently going to make any kind of effort to have a more representative electoral system at the federal level more fraught. That's always going to be just inherently difficult. That's why it's difficult now to make changes. The electoral system as it is now inherently benefits certain groups, and those groups don't want to change it. But without those groups' support, you can't change it. So they effectively have a veto on constitutional change in that regard. And as a result, the system as a whole becomes less representative over time, owing to demographic changes. But there's just not much you can do about it right now. Corresponding. So it's unlikely we will ever have like a single national parliament in a European vein in that. Like that. We're almost always going to have something decentralized. And it's always going to be just yeoman's work reaching any kind of consensus on how to reform and modernize political institutions of the United States. Yeah, there's different things you can do. You can do ranked choice voting, etc. And I was reading recently that it used to be normal to do what was called fusion voting. So what they would do is they would vote for a given candidate, just like you would do. You had different parties you could vote for, but with fusion voting, what would happen is that the leader of the party you were voting for could actually allow the votes that they received to be allocated to another candidate. So this actually used to be the norm in the United States up until the late 19th century. So if there was a party you didn't like, if there was no major party that you liked, you could vote for some other guy. And that guy could say, hey, if one of you major parties wants my votes, you're going to have to give me something or promise to do something or just give some kind of concession. And so that resulted in, coalition building and by the exchange of favors, right? The major parties would basically buy votes from these people by giving them political concessions of one kind or another, or maybe just bribing them. The reason fusion voting is not a thing anymore is because it was banned, because it was associated with corruption. It was also associated with black people, which was a problem in the 1870s and 80s. A lot of people saw fusion voting as favoring African-American voters in the South. And of course, there was a big turn away from equal rights in the South over the course of Reconstruction. And by the 1880s, people were looking for ways to try to stymie attempts by African-American voters to build coalitions with poor whites. And one of the ways that was sabotaged was by banning fusion voting, which was one of the mechanisms by which that emerging coalition was being constructed.
Today I learned.
Yeah, if you want more fun trivia on this, there was actually discussion of having a proportional voting system implemented at the state level, especially in the South. And ultimately, this was banned as well. Yeah, not at the national level, but at the state level. So this was deemed, I believe it was deemed unconstitutional. And the idea was that it was an attempt by Southern states to try to further marginalize African-American voters, because they were basically trying to basically people were voting according to race in the South, as they did then, to a degree still do, but certainly, especially then. And the fear was that basically with a proportional voting system, the whites would have permanent political power. And so an electoral system predicated on first past the post geographic electoral spaces, districts, that's the word I want. An electoral system based on first past the post districts was seen as offering more opportunities for African Americans to achieve equal representation in states, specifically Southern states again.
I think we talked about this kind of different formats of parties and voting once when we were talking about the way that Brazil does it, because don't they have like a million political parties, but they're all relatively weak? So you kind of have to pick and choose. Do you have few parties that are more powerful, or do you have many parties where it's hard to get anything done?
Yeah, well, the result there is a lot of horse trading, and the individual politicians tend to be very mercenary. It's also very common in Brazil for people to just arbitrarily change parties. That's very common as well. So yeah, it's not so much a choice between stronger parties that can get stuff done and weaker parties that are more fractious. It's more about strong institutions versus weak institutions. Like, you can have a multi-party system that is functional and delivers results. You can have a two-party system that is functional and delivers results. But then by the same token, if you have poorly designed institutions and if you have political actors in your political system who are not interested in maintaining political norms or respecting the integrity of democratic institutions, then the result is going to be dysfunction invariably. Like, it doesn't matter how good your institutions are, unless people as individuals within that political system are willing to respect the norms that govern it and make it viable, it's not going to work. And none of it's going to work if you have just piss poor designed institutions in the first place. So it comes down to institutions, and the health of institutions comes down to design, path dependency, historical factors, political culture, a whole bunch of like soft and fuzzy academic type stuff that people find boring. But in Brazil, political institutions tend to be weaker, and so that's more the problem than just having a shit ton of parties.
Gotcha.
But yeah, in Brazil, just very weak parties. People switch parties all the time. Like, it's a lot more about the game than it is about public policy in Brazil's political culture. It's about who you're doing deals with, who can scratch your back, who can give you concessions, etc. There's lots of trading of that variety in Brazilian politics. Did you see Canada in the news?
Someone in chat was saying that they honored some World War II veteran or something that was bad to do, but I didn't actually see an article about that.
That's one of two major stories that have come out of Canada in the past couple weeks. Canada has been weirdly active lately.
Huh.
Yeah, and both of the stories are weird and kind of goofy. So the first story, the World War II one, the guy in chat mentioned, so that had to do with a visit by President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to Canada. And so you know how it is, like when you have a foreign dignitary come visit the legislature, people in the legislature, usually the speaker, generally feels like they have to do something a little special, a little extra to kind of honor them and respect them. Mm-hmm. So in this case, the speaker of Canada's parliament decided that, during the visit, he would, during a speech, introduce a veteran of World War II, a Ukrainian veteran who had fought against the Soviets, supposedly against Soviet occupation. And he was introduced as a war veteran, and everybody stood up and applauded, and then he went on with the speech. And it later came out that that guy was not only a veteran of World War II who had fought against the Soviets and Soviet occupation, he had specifically been a member of an SS division called the Galicia Division.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the FS and the Galicia Division had been implicated over the course of the war and after in any number of atrocities targeting the Jewish population, as well as just sundry other political enemies. I mean, they basically were Nazis, in effect.
That's very awkward.
Yeah, standing ovation in Canada's legislature for what was, in effect, a Ukrainian Nazi. All the more awkward given that Russia's whole propaganda about the war in Ukraine is that the country was effectively taken over by Ukrainian Nazis in the Euromaidan Revolution in 2014. Mm. So everybody's looking pretty dumb here, yeah. Especially the Speaker of the Parliament, who had failed to do the necessary background research to figure that out. He basically just had this guy who was a veteran, he was Ukrainian, he was like, oh yeah, we'll just introduce him, no problem. And just kind of ignored any further background track that might have kind of cleared him of any controversy. That guy has stepped down from the speakership role since then. That was a significant controversy up there.
Damn. Whoops.
Yeah, that's actually, from what I was reading, that's not necessarily a new issue, because what happened is that a lot of Ukrainians were given, a lot of Ukrainian refugees were allowed to come to Canada after World War II. Mm-hmm. And the Canadian government was not particularly picky, about like vetting them for ties to the Nazis or the Galicia Division or what have you. So they've got a decent number of guys who had collaborated at one point or another. And over the past half century, there have been times when that was at issue. And there have been times when the government investigated it. There were commissions, and eventually a lot of the people who were implicated were cleared by the Canadian government. They weren't able to prove decisively that this, that, or the other individual person was, a member of the Galicia Division, or if they had been a member of the Galicia Division, that they had engaged in war crimes of one kind or another. But of course, how do you prove war crimes that happened almost a century ago? Kind of difficult. And it's not like there's a whole lot of records left over from that period. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of been a controversial sore point, but because the number of people involved has been pretty small, it generally hasn't really cropped up much. Mm-hmm. So I don't entirely blame the speaker for being ignorant of that issue. It hasn't really been like a mainstay thing in Canadian politics for a long time, probably a couple decades. So he had to learn the hard way that is, in fact, a long-standing issue, albeit one that has been covered up somewhat by time. So that was the first weird thing that happened in Canada over the past 2 weeks. The other thing has to do with India. Have you heard about this at all?
Nope.
So, where do you even start with this story? Long story short, there was a separatist movement in Punjab province back in the 1980s. And of course, India cracked down on them violently. And a lot of the people involved in the movement ended up, either arrested, dead, or leaving India altogether. And some of them ended up in Canada. And, they didn't engage in anything explicitly illegal in Canada, or at least nothing that they could be convicted for. And over time, they were able to slowly build up and reconstitute their movement in Canada. And the result of that is that the Punjabi community in Canada, which is fairly large, I think they're the majority of they're a majority of the Indian diaspora in Canada at this point, if I'm not mistaken. And over time, the Khalistani movement, as it's called, in Canada, has gained a lot more traction amongst the Punjabi community. By no means a majority. Most people in the community don't really care that much, but they've gotten to be a sizable enough part of the community that they are relevant politically. So, the overall Indian community in Canada has grown to be a point where that is an important voting bloc in Canadian politics. And Canadian governments, specifically the Trudeau administration, kind of go out of their way to try to cater to that community. And because the Khalistani movement is sufficiently popular amongst that community, the Trudeau government has historically been pretty cagey about the Khalistani movement. Again, in general, the Khalistani movement in Canada does not engage in a lot of criminal activity or terrorist activity for that matter, but there have been links and certainly no shortage of allegations. The Indian government is absolutely apoplectic about them. They fucking hate them, and they want the Canadian government to basically deport all of them as terrorists, or at least to arrest them if they have citizenship. And the Canadian government's attitude is, well, we have freedom of speech. We can't just, go after these people when they haven't done anything illegal in Canada. At least nothing that can be proven. Mm-hmm. So the Trudeau administration kind of toes the line between electoral self-interest and kind of soft-pedaling the Canadian government's treatment of a group that has some ties to radical groups in India. They toe that line and balance it with the need to maintain good relations with India, which, of course, does have some substantive ties with Canada. Not substantive for India so much, pretty small in that regard, but for Canada, it's an important trade partner. Mm. And of course, electorally, you don't want to alienate a country of origin for a good chunk of your electorate. So self-interest there in that regard as well. Now, that said, the Khalistani movement has been alleged to have been involved in some terrorist activity back in the 80s. There was a bombing of an Air Canada flight back in the 80s that was linked to the Khalistani movement. And supposedly that was supposed to be revenge against the Indian government. But despite investigating it, they were never able to really implicate anybody and convict anybody for involvement. So even though it's strongly suspected that the Khalistani movement in Canada was connected to it, it hasn't really been proven. And so the Canadian government says that its hands are tied and they can't really convict anybody, but then the Indian government, of course, says that's a cop-out and that they could totally do it if they really wanted to. And given that a lot of people have been killed, both in that terrorist attack and in the Khalistani separatist movement in the 80s generally, the Indian government is absolutely insistent that the Khalistani movement is a terrorist organization and that Canada needs to pass and enforce the relevant anti-terrorism laws accordingly. So this has kind of been a running sore in relations between India and Canada for a while. But what happened recently is that a Khalistani activist in Canada named Najjar, I think his name was assassinated. He was killed. And it wasn't really clear who did it. It's not the first time it's happened. There was a similar case, I think, a couple of years ago. It might be the same case. I don't quite remember. But what came out recently is that Trudeau apparently has said that he has received intelligence from an ally, which everybody is assuming is the United States, a fellow Five Eyes intelligence member. Trudeau says that he has received intelligence, which he believes is credible and substantive, that the Indian government may actually have been involved in the assassination of that activist. And that's a pretty big deal. Mm-hmm. When a government assassinates somebody in another country, especially when that person has Canadian citizenship, that's a violation of that country's sovereignty. And that's going to be taken very seriously. So the question is that true? Thus far, the Trudeau administration has not revealed the evidence in question. They probably won't reveal it, given that it was probably collected through somewhat nefarious, dubious means. U.S. intelligence gathering spans the entire earth and casts a very wide net. And it would not really look good for the United States to be revealed to be spying on, Indian transmissions, given that we're trying to cultivate good relations with India right now. Mm-hmm. So in terms of evidence, we can't really tell whether or not it's substantive, because the Canadian government has not released it and probably will not. But the fact that the Canadian government came out and explicitly said that this was the case, that there is some intelligence suggesting the Indian government's culpability, that's a big red flag. That's a serious accusation that I would not expect to be made unless there was real substantive intelligence behind it. There's no reason for the Canadian government to jeopardize relations with India if there is not substantive intelligence to this effect. Some people have said that it's not serious, that it's not a serious allegation, and that Trudeau is just trying to build support amongst the Khalistani movement in order to win votes in Canada. But it seems like there's better ways to do that, if that's the case. If he wanted to do that, he could do that without alienating the Indian government. It wouldn't be that hard. So it seems like this is something he's gone out of his way to do. And so for that reason, I suspect it's going to be credible. Now, what happens because of it, anybody's guess. Probably nothing. Canada and the United States, again, are trying to cultivate good relations with India as a kind of counterweight to China. So it may be that even if the Indian government was involved, that it's going to be dealt with through unofficial channels. We probably won't be reading about it in the media. We probably, in that case, should not have been reading about it in the media in the first place. But Trudeau apparently felt it necessary to come out and air this grievance publicly. So now it's a thing. When you make it a thing, when you air grievances like this publicly, it kind of becomes more difficult to deal with it through unofficial channels, because it becomes a political issue that people in all parties involved feel compelled to address publicly. If it's not public, then you can just talk privately and you can kind of hash things out and come to some kind of agreement and understanding. But now that it's public, it's a political thing. People in Canada are going to argue, certainly the Conservatives in Canada are arguing that this is a problem that the Trudeau administration is not handling well, and that they need to take substantive action one way or the other. Either deal with it more quietly or loudly assert Canada's sovereignty. And then, of course, the Indian government denies categorically that they have any involvement, but also say that it's a terrorist organization, that this guy was a radical, and that something needed to be done about it. So they didn't kill him, but it's a good thing that he's dead. And if they did kill him, Canada should really thank them.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a diplomatic kerfuffle. Honestly, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. It's probably not going to blow up any more than it is. It's probably just going to disappear after a while. I think the Trudeau administration kind of fumbled it a little bit by going public. I don't know why he did that. I don't think it serves any real purpose, unless he wants to make it a substantive diplomatic issue. But there's not really much Canada, of all countries, can really do there as far as coercing Indian behavior. So probably write a sternly worded message if it's not a substantive allegation. If it is a substantive allegation, there's probably going to be very serious negotiations in the background that are done very quietly in order to deter future such incidences.
Interesting. Yeah, Canada's usually pretty quiet. For them to be big on the dramas, change of pace.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of put the United States in an awkward position, too, because, obviously, as an ally of Canada, we want to stand by our ally and help them defend their sovereignty. But India is a big prize, and there's a lot of things Washington is going to be willing to sacrifice to get that prize. So geostrategically, we're probably going to have to deal with this quietly and deftly in order to balance the interests of all parties involved. So I don't think, I think the U.S. will be involved in resolving this, but I don't think it's something we're going to be reading about in public very much. This is probably going to be dealt with more in back rooms, most likely.
Interesting.
Yeah, India is quite up and coming. They're very important geostrategically. I think some analysts kind of oversell the degree to which India is going to become economically dominant. I'm a little more skeptical about that. But in terms of just strategic importance, yeah, definitely India is very relevant and is going to become a lot more relevant going forward in coming decades. Yeah, if they really want their economy to take off and really supercharge India as a major regional power, if not world power, they would have to implement a lot of structural economic reforms and really, in order to really open things up, generate a lot of new jobs, new industries, and especially new technologies. They've got the human capital to do it. Indian people are just whip smart. India is awesome. India is a really fun case study if you're interested in history, anthropology, politics. Like, there's never not something new to learn about India. Just given how big the country is and how much history it has, like, it's really fun to learn about it because there's always something new. And that's just indicative of the depth of India, like structurally, institutionally, historically, culturally. And that really shines in the quality of the human capital, right? They just got a lot of really smart people. So if they could leverage that, they could grow a lot more than what they're doing. But the trouble is they're not. And there's a lot of institutional reasons why it's not happening and why it probably won't happen. The political economy of India is really biased in favor of a strong state role in the economy, which is not inherently bad if you do it right. But you can probably guess whether or not India is doing it right. Not really.
Yeah.
That's a long-standing problem in India. If they could ever figure it out, they could stand to benefit greatly. But as is, there's just too many vested interest groups that don't want to change things and make it virtually impossible. So most likely they're going to be largely stuck with the political economy they have, not the political economy that they want. And that's going to hold them back considerably. Well, what else did we have? Violence in Azerbaijan. That's been a big thing. I was talking to Mass Neotech about that the other day. Talked about Canada. The scandal. I forgot it. Are we doing okay on time?
Well, yeah. There's a Terran who's playing like Super Turtle, so it could be a minute. Normally we would have ended 7 minutes ago, but they hold up on a couple bases and they're making the defensive stuff. Chat loves to see these games.
Okay, did you see the scandal in the United States around Senator Menendez?
Is that the fire alarm guy, or is that a different one?
What, fire alarm guy?
There's a fire alarm guy. Yeah, there was supposed to be some vote somewhere that was going to happen, but it didn't happen because someone delayed it due to pulling a fire alarm. I don't know if it stopped the vote or if it was just a delay.
I've not heard about that.
Yeah, that's a classic, man. People used to do that in college to make us not have to take our tests and stuff.
Oh, I'm going to have to read about that later.
Yeah.
Jamal Bowman, Democrat, denies setting off fire alarm to stall spending vote. Wow.
Yep.
I remember when you think... Go ahead.
People used to do that at TAMS, the Texas Academy of Math and Science. They would pull it before the biology exam. It was a senior tradition, so it's a early university program. You start 2 years early, and the seniors would usually pull the fire alarm for the final exam of the juniors, just to kind of throw a wrench in their situation. And that was a tradition that was kept while I was there. The faculty didn't really appreciate it, but
I don't imagine. Well, that's not the scandal I had in mind. So you may find this of interest if it's new to you. So there's a senator named Menendez from New Jersey. He's a high-ranking senior senator who had served as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is, it is the main foreign policy committee in the Senate. So it's pretty important as far as foreign policy goes. Been around a long time, been influencing American foreign policy a long time. And so it was notable then when the FBI announced that he was under investigation for explicit bribery.
Ooh.
And when I say bribery, I don't mean like the kind of influence operations that we've talked about before, right? Revolving door in Washington, that kind of stuff. Nothing so subtle. They were allegedly outright bribing him, not only with cash, but with bricks of gold.
Wow.
They raided his house, and they found cash stuffed in his jacket, stuffed in his safe, stuffed in just everywhere, stuffed in his car.
He was very bribed.
Oh yeah, he was very bribed. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, they found money stuffed in the lining of his congressional jacket. Like, just comical. It's just a comical degree of bribery, alleged bribery. They haven't proven it yet, but it's not looking good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the funniest part was they alleged that he was bribed with gold bars, and apparently, when he got back from a trip to Egypt, he Googled how much is a pound of gold worth.
Oh man. Jeez.
Not very subtle.
The evidence has been created.
So the allegation is that he was bribed by the government of Egypt. That's specifically the party that seems to be involved, allegedly. Uh-huh. And supposedly what they were asking for is that, one, that he provide cover for certain businessmen that were associated with the Egyptian government. And when I say provide cover, I mean that they would be sometimes investigated, or they would engage in, dubious activity, or maybe there was a project or a contract that they wanted, and Menendez would basically lend his political weight to that. If they were under investigation, he would kind of poo-poo it and say it's not really necessary, they're legitimate, I know them, I can vouch for them. And, just in general, he would vouch for them. That's the main thing that he would do. Whatever political connections he had, he would use for them. And then supposedly the other thing that they were bribing him for was to ensure that military aid to Egypt would continue. Which seemed weird to me, because the U.S. aid to Egypt is going to continue pretty much regardless. I don't really think you need to bribe somebody for that.
Don't tell him that, then he's not going to get all that gold.
Well, really? Well, I mean, the issue there is that military aid to Egypt was a condition of the peace treaty that was negotiated at Camp David in the late 1970s between Egypt and Israel. Those were the famous Camp David Accords. So the United States mediated that agreement, and one of the conditions involved is that, so long as Egypt recognized Israel's legitimacy and independence as a state, Egypt would receive military aid from the United States. And we've continued that for a long time, even through the Arab Spring. So I don't think the U.S. is going to cut them off unless they just do something like an egregious violation of human rights. And even then, we'll probably turn a blind eye. Mm-hmm. For example, when the military seized control of Egypt again after the Arab Spring happened, right, when they had elections and the Muslim Brotherhood was in power, the Egyptian military staged a coup, seized control, and then basically turned Egypt into an even more authoritarian state than it already was, exclusively totalitarian, I would argue, from what I was reading. And when that happened, there was a question in the United States about whether the government should recognize that it was a coup or not. Because legally speaking, there are laws on the books in the United States that require the government to cut off a country from aid if the government of the United States officially recognizes a coup to have happened in that country. And the United States government, then under the presidency of Barack Obama, actually deliberately chose not to call it a coup, specifically to circumvent those legal requirements. So we could easily do something like that again if necessary, even if they did commit human rights violations again. I don't doubt that would be likely, given that the United States is nominally, at least, well, not nominally, is really committed to the security of Israel in the region, given that Israel is kind of bulwark of American influence in the Middle East. So, again, just to bring this full circle, I don't know why they were bribing Menendez to do that. That seemed to be just baked into American foreign policy. Maybe they felt they had to in order to ensure it. People from more authoritarian political cultures sometimes don't really understand how liberal democracies and the political culture of liberal democracies works. So they don't really think any kind of commitment from a government or from an individual in a government is really credible until there's some kind of financial stake, be it the promise of a job or, gold bars, as the case apparently may be. So differences in political culture could lead them to have believed that a bribe was necessary in order to continue that sport, even though it really wasn't. But the support to the businessmen may have been more important. And that's probably what the FBI is going to kind of home in on. Oh, there was a specific list of favors that were requested. Helping local businessmen stay out of jail, greenlighting arms deals with the Egyptian military, also not really necessary. Don't know why they were doing that. Prosecutors allege his wife, Nadine Arslanian, was paid through a no-show job at an Egyptian meat company. So that's an example of a revolving door there to a degree. No-show jobs are a very common form of influence. I'm not going to bribe you, but I am going to give you a job in which you have to do fuck all. And in fact, you don't even have to show up. It's totally fine.
Wow.
I'll just pay you to do the job that you're totally not doing or even showing up for. But it's not a bribe, although it is conditional on you doing X, Y, and Z. But it's not a bribe. Don't worry about it. Let's see. Also, the FBI found hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and gold at his wife's suburban home. That's what I mentioned before about finding cash and gold just strewn about everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he's in trouble. I don't think he's going to be able to weasel his way out of this one. And a lot of people in New Jersey and in the Senate are asking him to resign. And of course, he said that, no, I'm not going to resign. He has said that he will temporarily, and he has done this, he has temporarily stepped down as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But he insists that he'll be back once he's cleared everything up. Yeah, he's an older guy, so he probably figures that he's got the political chops to kind of maneuver his way out of this. And, who's to say? Maybe he's right. We'll see. But I'm pretty dubious. He very much seems to be on his last legs at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that was the big scandal out of the Senate the past week.
That's funny. Chat saying no-show jobs were very common in the U.S. organized crime since the 70s, right?
I had never heard that specifically, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I talked about, how corruption works on my trip with Trisha, was a lot of times a politician won't get a direct contribution of money, like a donation. It'll be, I think you mentioned, like their kid's college got paid for, which is indirect. They're benefiting from it directly, but it doesn't go into the slot that you would expect a more overt bribery, such as a huge cache of gold bars might go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, much easier to get away with it in that case.
Yeah. And then just it's almost cute, the lack of caution practiced by this individual in Googling how much it's worth and what to do with it. That's pretty funny. But I don't know if people know what you do with your computer most of the time is to an extent public. Someone can get that information if they really want to. They do need to be tech savvy to do that, but your privacy is less than you think it is. So if you're Googling stuff and you're logged into your Google account, Google knows what you're doing. So just be aware of that. That was a thing that Kukyo was very passionate about, was how much of our data and our information is harvested and how little privacy we actually have. So you've got the different avenues there of trying to build private spaces for yourself, or just accepting spaces that you don't have any privacy in and using that to inform your decision making for how you behave there. Did he at least Google it in incognito mode? Yep. That's the first baby step in that direction.
Yeah, there you go. If you want to Google how much your bribe gold is worth, do it in incognito mode.
Truly, your search will be inscrutable in that case. Well, nice. I'm glad we got to... Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, before we head out, there was just one other item I wanted to at least mention, and maybe we can talk about it more next time. I know I said I would talk about the Chinese economy this time, but the conversation kind of took its own course, so we didn't get to it. But next time, in addition to the Chinese economy, if we have time and the inclination, we'll also talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, because there is a war that effectively restarted between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. And this one has been just a steamroll. Armenia isn't even getting involved this time, and the army of the Republic of Artsakh, which is the government that had governed Nagorno-Karabakh, has surrendered, and they have agreed to disarm. So the result is that the disputed territory in question is going to be fully reintegrated into Azerbaijan after 30-some years being separated from it and having a government propped up by the Armenian state. And unfortunately, the result has been basically the exodus of the entire Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, about 150-some thousand people.
Damn, where are they going?
They're heading out to Armenia.
Hmm.
And so the Armenian government is kind of trying and struggling to try to provide for everybody. You know, Armenia is not a big country.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, a big influx like that is hard to deal with administratively, but, you know, they feel compelled to try to help what they see as their countrymen,
Mm-hmm.
you know, fellow ethnic Armenians. And Azerbaijan, for its part, is looking forward to, you know, reconquering the territory, which included not only, excuse me, not only Nagorno-Karabakh, but also surrounding territory. They'd already taken a lot of the surrounding territory back that the Armenians had been occupying. But there had been about half of the actual territory of Nagorno-Karabakh that they had not seized yet. So they're going to get that back. And all of the ethnic Azeri people who had been expelled or who had fled during the earlier war in the early 90s are going to come back, hypothetically.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, one conflict that resulted in the expulsion of the ethnic Azeri population is now being followed by the second iteration of the same conflict, in which all of the expelled population are going to come back, but in which the Armenian population will now be expelled.
Mm-hmm.
So tit-for-tat ethnic cleansing, effectively.
Damn.
So thoughts and prayers, if you like, for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. They're having a rough time. The attack, the invasion, I should say, happened after almost a year of being blockaded by the Azerbaijani military. You know, under the peace deal from the previous iteration of the conflict in 2020, the Azerbaijanis were supposed to allow the Republic of Artsakh to continue to maintain connection logistically to the outside world through the Lachin corridor, but eventually the Azerbaijan government reneged on that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were cut off from food, medicine, and pretty much anything else that they could not make themselves. And given that it's a very small, poor territory, there was not really much they could make themselves. So the population and the government and the army, for that matter, of the Republic of Artsakh were in a pretty bad way by the time the Azerbaijani army came.
Mm-hmm.
And that partly explains why the surrender happened so quickly. Like, it was just painfully apparent that they would not be able to hold out. So a new disaster for the Armenians, anyway. For the Azerbaijanis, they're delighted because the territory in question was always internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, even though the ethnic population was mostly Armenian.
Mm-hmm.
So from their perspective, they're just getting their land back.
Gotcha.
But yeah, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to lose their property, lose their homes, etc. Again, about 150,000 some Armenians in the Nagorno-Karabakh territory are now effectively homeless.
Damn.
So if you have any assistance you want to give them, now's a good time for it, because they definitely need it.
For sure. Chat saying we get a new System of a Down album. Yeah, a lot of people don't know they're Armenian. And there's a very large Armenian community in LA as well. I know a lot of my girlfriend's friends are Armenian, which is pretty cool. Hope things get better for them. But I appreciate you breaking things down for us today. We got some nice U.S. Soviet history that I didn't know about, which was cool. We do some interesting random tangents that are not planned ahead of time. Just so you know, these segments are not scripted. We start from a random question, usually involving video games or food, and then we pivot into movies and then talk about the world. So if you have any comments or correction for us, feel free to leave those in the YouTube comments. Also, we accept scathing reviews and glowing reviews. So appreciate you all weighing in. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
20-minute walk challenge.
Fuck.
Got him. Let's go.